Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. James Joseph Bulger Jr., better known as Whitey, was born on September 3, 1929, in Dorchester, Massachusetts. He rose to prominence as the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American organized crime group based in Boston. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Bulger's gang was involved in various illicit activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and numerous murders. His influence extended deep into the fabric of Boston's underworld, and he managed to evade law enforcement for years, partly due to his role as an FBI informant, which provided him with protection and insider information. In 1994, facing imminent indictment, Bulger fled Boston and remained a fugitive for 16 years. During this period, he was listed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, with reported sightings across various countries. Despite extensive manhunts, Bulger managed to elude capture, leading to widespread speculation and intrigue about his whereabouts. Bulger's run from the law came to an end on June 22, 2011, when he was arrested in Santa Monica, California. Living under the alias Charles Gasco, he had been residing in a rent-controlled apartment with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. The arrest was a result of a renewed media campaign by the FBI, which focused on Gregg, leading to a tip that ultimately exposed their location. Inside the apartment, authorities found weapons, cash, and numerous false identifications. The money, amounting to over $800,000, was hidden in the walls, a testament to Bulger's paranoia and preparation for a life on the run. His arrest sent shockwaves across Boston, where many still remembered the fear he had instilled. Some saw justice finally catching up to a man responsible for countless crimes, while others, particularly those in the neighborhoods he once controlled, remained divided on their views of him. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile criminal cases in recent American history. Prosecutors detailed his involvement in 19 murders, extortion schemes, and drug trafficking. Former associates took the stand, offering chilling testimonies of Bulger's ruthlessness. His defense team attempted to paint him as a criminal, but not an informant, arguing that he had never cooperated with the FBI despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The courtroom was filled with families of his victims, journalists, and curious spectators eager to see the man who had evaded justice for so long. Bulger, even in his old age, carried an air of defiance, often dismissing witnesses and refusing to testify on his behalf. The trial lasted for weeks, with each day revealing more details about his crimes and the extent of corruption that had allowed him to operate with near impunity for decades. When the verdict was finally read, Bulger was found guilty on multiple counts, including murder, racketeering, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years in prison. The judge, in his closing remarks, called him a cunning and depraved criminal who had inflicted immeasurable pain on his victims and their families. Even behind bars, Bulger's legacy loomed large. His story had been one of power, violence, and betrayal, both of his enemies and those who had trusted him. In 2018, at the age of 89, he was killed in prison by fellow inmates, an ending that many saw as fitting for a man who had built his life on brutality. His death closed a chapter in Boston's long history of organized crime, but his name remains infamous, a symbol of how corruption and violence can intertwine in the darkest corners of society. Bulger's capture in 2011 marked the end of an era, but it was only the beginning of a complex legal battle that would captivate the nation. The government had spent decades trying to bring him to justice, and now that he was finally in custody, the full extent of his crimes was about to be exposed. As the prosecution prepared its case, the details of his violent reign over Boston's underworld began to resurface, shocking even those who had followed his criminal career for years. The Winter Hill Gang, under Bulger's leadership, operated with ruthless efficiency. They controlled much of the city's illegal gambling, loan sharking, and drug distribution networks. Those who crossed Bulger often disappeared without a trace. His preferred method of maintaining power was a combination of fear and manipulation. He had informants everywhere, keeping him ahead of law enforcement, and his reputation for brutality ensured that few dared to challenge him. One of the most infamous aspects of Bulger's criminal career was his relationship with the FBI. While the agency was tasked with taking down organized crime, certain agents became entangled in Bulger's web of corruption. For years, He provided information on rival criminals in exchange for protection from prosecution. This arrangement allowed him to operate with impunity, eliminating competition while avoiding serious legal consequences. In court, prosecutors detailed how Bulger had used his informant status to orchestrate murders and extortion schemes. Witnesses included former gang members, victims' family members, and law enforcement officials who had once pursued him. Many of these witnesses had lived in fear of Bulger for decades, and now, they finally had the chance to confront him. One of the most emotional testimonies came from the relatives of Deborah Davis, a young woman who had been dating one of Bulger's associates. She had reportedly learned too much about the gang's activities, and Bulger allegedly ordered her murder. Her brother took the stand, his voice shaking with anger and grief as he described the years of unanswered questions and silent suffering his family had endured. Other families told similar stories, each one adding to the horrifying portrait of a man who had operated outside the law for so long. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bulger remained defiant throughout the trial. He refused to take the stand in his own defense, dismissing the proceedings as a sham. His legal team attempted to challenge the credibility of witnesses, many of whom were former criminals who had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. But the sheer volume of testimony, combined with physical evidence linking Bulger to numerous crimes, left little doubt about his guilt. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted to the corruption within the FBI that had allowed Bulger to thrive for so long. Testimony revealed that certain agents had actively protected him, tipping him off about investigations and helping him evade arrest. This aspect of the case outraged the public, raising serious questions about the integrity of law enforcement during the height of Bulger's power. Bulger's defense team tried to argue that he had never been an informant, insisting that his relationship with the FBI had been exaggerated. But the evidence, including FBI documents and testimony from former agents, painted a different picture. Bulger had manipulated the system to his advantage, using law enforcement as a tool in his criminal empire. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Witness after witness described Bulger's acts of violence in chilling detail. A former associate recounted how Bulger had personally strangled a man with his bare hands. Another described being ordered to dig graves for Bulger's victims. Each testimony added another layer to the already staggering case against him. Public interest in the trial was immense. Courtroom sketches of the aging gangster made front-page news, and television networks provided daily updates on the proceedings. Many in Boston, especially those who had lived through Bulger's reign, watched with a mix of fascination and relief. For some, seeing Bulger finally brought to justice was a long overdue reckoning. For others, particularly those who had feared him for so long, it was difficult to believe he was truly powerless at last. As the case neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a final, damning statement. Bulger, they argued, was not just a criminal. He was a remorseless predator who had used his intelligence and connections to terrorize a city for decades. They urged the jury to hold him accountable for his crimes, emphasizing the suffering he had inflicted on so many people. The defense, in contrast, could offer little more than attempts to discredit witnesses and downplay Bulger's FBI connections. Their arguments, however, did little to sway the jury. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the testimonies too numerous, the crimes too horrific. The nation held its breath as the jury deliberated. Bulger, who had spent his life controlling others, now had no control over what came next. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was finally announced. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge prepared to read the verdict. The jury had deliberated for over 30 hours, sifting through weeks of testimony and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The weight of their decision was enormous. James Whitey Bulger had spent decades as a shadow over Boston, a man whose name was whispered in fear. Now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Bulger sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. One by one, the charges were read aloud. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The list went on, confirming what many had long suspected, but had never seen proven in a court of law. Whitey Bulger was a murderer, a criminal mastermind, and a man who had built his empire on intimidation, betrayal, and death. As the final charge was announced, a ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom. Family members of his victims, many of whom had waited decades for justice, began to weep. Some clutched one another, offering support in a moment that was both triumphant and deeply painful. Others remained frozen, as if still processing the reality that Bulger had finally been held accountable. Bulger himself showed no visible reaction. At 83 years old, he was frail, but there was no sign of remorse. Throughout the trial, he had refused to acknowledge his crimes, dismissing witnesses, cursing at prosecutors, and even ridiculing former associates who testified against him. Now, faced with the judgment of the court, he simply sat there, a relic of a violent past that had finally caught up with him. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence. 2 life terms plus 5 years. No chance of parole. No possibility of ever walking free again. The severity of the punishment was a statement, not just about Bulger himself, but about the justice system's attempt to rectify the failures that had allowed him to operate for so long. The judge's words were sharp, laced with disgust for the man before him. He called Bulger a cunning and depraved criminal, a man who had inflicted untold suffering on his victims and their families. He condemned not only Bulger's violence, but also his manipulation of the FBI, his willingness to turn on allies, and his utter lack of conscience. For some of Bulger's victims' families, the sentencing brought a measure of closure. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael had been gunned down by Bulger's men in 1982, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. For 30 years, we lived in fear, wondering if justice would ever come. Today, we finally got what we needed. He's going away forever. But not everyone was satisfied. Some felt that the FBI itself had not been held accountable for enabling Bulger's crimes. His secret relationship with corrupt agents had allowed him to evade arrest for years, tipping him off to investigations and ensuring that his rivals, not he, were the ones taken down. Though a few agents had been prosecuted, the full extent of the corruption within law enforcement remained a bitter wound for many. Bulger was transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. Even behind bars, his name carried weight. Some inmates viewed him as a legendary figure, a gangster who had defied the system for decades. Others saw him as a rat, a man who had sold out his own associates while pretending to be untouchable. His time in prison was not easy. Bulger, once the most feared man in Boston, was now just another aging criminal, stripped of power and influence. He spent much of his time in isolation, aware that his reputation made him a target. At 89 years old, he was moved to the high-security Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia, a decision that would prove to be fatal. On the morning of October 30th, 2018, less than 24 hours after his transfer, Bulger was found dead in his cell. His face had been brutally beaten beyond recognition, his body left in a pool of blood. Prison officials described the attack as swift and violent, carried out with the kind of ruthlessness Bulger himself had once inflicted on others. The prime suspects were fellow inmates with connections to organized crime. One of them, Foccio's Freddie Hayes, was a known mafia enforcer with a personal hatred for informants. Another was a former hitman from Bulger's own criminal world. Though the exact details of the killing remain unclear, one thing was certain: Bulger had met the kind of end he had spent his life delivering to others. His death sparked a final wave of public reaction. Some saw it as fitting, a poetic justice that the legal system had failed to deliver. Others questioned how an elderly, high-profile prisoner had been placed in a facility where he would be so vulnerable. Even in death, Bulger remained controversial, a man whose crimes and connections left a deep scar on the American justice system. His legacy is a complicated one. For law enforcement, his story remains a lesson in the dangers of corruption and unchecked power. For the families of his victims, his name is a reminder of the pain and loss he inflicted. And for the city of Boston, he is both a ghost of its darkest past and a symbol of the fight for justice that, however delayed, finally caught up with him. Story 2. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho Matador or Killer Petey, was one of Brazil's most infamous serial killers. Born on July 17, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Minas Gerais, he had a violent childhood that shaped his future. His first murder came at the age of 14, when he killed the vice mayor of his town, believing the man had wrongfully fired his father from a school security guard position. From that moment, he embarked on a spree of killings, targeting those he considered criminals or enemies, a pattern that would continue for decades. During the 1970s, Rodrigues gained notoriety for hunting down and murdering local drug dealers, gang members, and others involved in illegal activities. He justified his actions as a form of vigilante justice, eliminating those he believed deserved to die. However, his crimes were far from lawful, and his brutal methods earned him a reputation as one of Brazil's most feared killers. In 1973, at the age of 19, he was arrested and charged with multiple homicides, but his violent behavior did not stop behind bars. While imprisoned, Rodriguez continued to kill, often preying on fellow inmates he deemed irredeemable. Reports suggest he was responsible for at least 40 murders while in custody. Despite his staggering body count, Brazil's legal system placed a maximum sentence of 30 years on any prisoner, meaning Rodriguez would eventually be released. In 2007, after serving his time, he walked free. His release sparked controversy, with many fearing he would return to his old ways. Initially, he appeared to live a quiet life, keeping out of trouble and even giving interviews where he claimed he had reformed. But in 2011, he was arrested again, this time on charges including inciting riot and deprivation of liberty. The circumstances of his rearrest suggested he had not abandoned his violent tendencies, reigniting public debate over whether Brazil's penal system had failed in handling dangerous criminals like him. Rodriguez's case highlighted ongoing flaws in Brazil's justice system. His ability to continue killing within prison, and the fact that he was released despite his extensive criminal record, exposed the limitations of sentencing laws at the time. His story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of what happens when the legal system is ill-equipped to deal with individuals who seem incapable of rehabilitation. The public response to his rearrest was intense. Many questioned why a man responsible for so many deaths had ever been allowed to walk free. Some argued that the legal cap on sentences needed reform, while others debated whether certain criminals should be permanently removed from society. The case forced lawmakers to confront the reality that Brazil's prison system was not just failing to rehabilitate violent offenders, but, in some cases, allowing them to continue their crimes even while incarcerated. Rodriguez, for his part, showed little remorse. Over the years, he had given various interviews in which he spoke about his past with chilling detachment. He described some of his murders in detail, often laughing or expressing no regret. His demeanor reinforced the belief that he was a man who saw violence as a natural part of life, someone who had lived by his own set of brutal rules for so long that he no longer recognized the concept of moral boundaries. As his case continued to unfold, Brazil watched with fascination and horror. He had spent years as both a feared killer and a symbol of the justice system's failures. His arrest in 2011 raised more questions than answers. Could a man like Pedro Rodrigues Filho ever truly change? Or was he simply proof that some people are beyond redemption? Rodriguez's 2011 arrest was met with a mixture of relief and outrage. To many, it was proof that his supposed reformation had been a facade, a temporary restraint on a man whose instincts were too deeply ingrained to suppress. His initial release in 2007 had already been controversial, with legal experts and the families of his victims questioning how a man responsible for so many murders, both inside and outside of prison, could be allowed back into society. The answer lay in the legal system itself. Brazil's penal code at the time restricted prison sentences to a maximum of 30 years, regardless of the severity or number of crimes committed. This meant that no matter how many people Rodriguez had killed, the law dictated that he could only serve 3 decades behind bars. Over time, legal reforms extended the maximum sentence to 40 years, but that change had come too late to affect Rodriguez's case. He had served his time under the existing framework and was therefore released, despite his history of extreme violence. After his release, Rodriguez initially kept a low profile. He moved to the countryside, where he claimed to live a peaceful life, dedicating himself to religion and personal reflection. In several interviews, he spoke of his past with an eerie sense of detachment, often admitting to his crimes but insisting he had changed. He presented himself as a reformed man, someone who had left behind a life of killing and now sought redemption. But many remained skeptical. Could a man who had taken so many lives, who had spent years killing even within the confines of prison, truly be rehabilitated? His psychological profile suggested otherwise. Unlike many serial killers, Rodriguez did not fit the mold of a calculating sociopath who operated in secrecy. His killings were often impulsive, fueled by his personal sense of justice, and carried out without concern for legal consequences. He was a man who viewed murder as a tool, as a means of correcting what he perceived as wrongs. His arrest in 2011 shattered any lingering illusions about his rehabilitation. The details surrounding his capture remained unclear at first, but reports indicated that he had been involved in a criminal dispute, leading to accusations of inciting riot and depriving someone of their liberty. While the charges were not as severe as the brutal killings of his past, they were enough to prove that he was still drawn to violence, unable or unwilling to break free from his old ways. Public reaction was swift. News of his arrest reignited debates about Brazil's justice system and whether it was equipped to handle criminals of his nature. Some saw his rearrest as a predictable failure, a sign that the legal system had been naive to believe he could ever be released safely. Others argued that his case was an anomaly, an extreme example that should not dictate broader policy decisions. Law enforcement officials were among those most vocal about the dangers Rodriguez posed. Officers who had worked on his case described him as one of the most dangerous individuals they had ever encountered, a man who operated by his own rules and seemed entirely unbothered by the weight of his crimes. Some officers openly admitted that they had never believed in his reformation, seeing his release as a legal technicality rather than a genuine decision based on rehabilitation. As Rodriguez awaited trial for his new charges, journalists and true crime enthusiasts dissected his past, revisiting the horrifying details of his previous crimes. They recounted his early murders, including the time he had hunted down and executed the man who had killed his pregnant girlfriend. They analyzed his time in prison, where he had continued his killing spree, taking the lives of criminals he deemed unworthy of redemption. One of the most chilling aspects of Rodriguez's past was his apparent lack of remorse. In interviews, he spoke about his murders with a casual indifference, sometimes even laughing as he recalled how he had executed his victims. When asked why he had continued killing in prison, his answer was simple: they were bad people, and they deserved to die. It was this mindset that had made him so terrifying, his belief that he was a force of justice, that his killings were not crimes but necessary actions. His case forced Brazil to confront an uncomfortable truth. Its prison system was not designed to contain men like him. Rodriguez had spent decades behind bars, and instead of being rehabilitated, he had become even more dangerous. He had turned prison into his hunting ground, using it as a place to continue his violent crusade. His eventual release had not been a decision based on his behavior or his readiness to reintegrate into society. It had simply been the result of a legal limit on sentencing. As his trial loomed, the country watched closely. Would this time be different? Would the justice system find a way to ensure that he would never again be allowed to walk free? Or would he, once again, slip through the cracks of a system that had already failed to contain him once before? The questions hung in the air, and with them, a chilling sense of uncertainty. As Pedro Rodriguez Filho sat in a prison cell once again, awaiting trial for his new charges, Brazil found itself grappling with a problem that extended far beyond just one man. His case was an extreme example of a broader issue: how the legal system handled violent criminals, particularly those who had demonstrated a repeated inability to function within society. His rearrest forced the country to confront the uncomfortable reality that its justice system had failed to prevent a known murderer from returning to crime. Rodriguez's story had already become the stuff of legend, a true crime saga that fascinated and horrified people in equal measure. His past killings had earned him a reputation as one of Brazil's most prolific serial killers, but his motivations had always set him apart from others in his category. He did not kill indiscriminately. He chose his victims carefully, targeting those he saw as corrupt, dangerous, or deserving of death. Some even viewed him as a twisted sort of anti-hero, a man who did what the justice system could not, or would not, do. But no matter how he justified his actions, the fact remained that he was a killer. He had taken dozens of lives, inside and outside of prison, without hesitation or remorse. Even when he spoke about his murders, his tone was disturbingly casual, as if he were discussing routine matters rather than the violent deaths of human beings. This lack of empathy was what terrified people the most. It wasn't just that he killed, it was that he seemed to believe he had the right to decide who lived and who died. His 2011 arrest might not have been for murder, but it raised serious questions about whether he would ever truly leave behind his violent tendencies. Reports suggested that he had been involved in a dispute with criminals from a local gang, leading to charges of inciting a riot and unlawfully imprisoning someone. The details were murky, but what was clear was that he had once again inserted himself into a world of crime, unable to stay away from the lifestyle that had defined him for so long. Many believed his return to violence was inevitable. He had spent the majority of his life behind bars, living in an environment where survival often depended on being the most ruthless person in the room. Even in a society that believed in second chances, Was it realistic to expect that someone with his history could simply walk away from everything he had known? Or had prison shaped him into something that could never be undone? His case reignited debates over whether Brazil's sentencing laws needed to be reformed. The fact that he had been released at all struck many as absurd, given that he had murdered over 70 people, including fellow inmates. How could a system claim to serve justice when a man like Rodriguez was allowed to walk free simply because he had reached a legal time limit? Should serial killers, particularly those who had demonstrated an ongoing pattern of violence, be eligible for parole at all? Some politicians and legal experts called for stricter sentencing guidelines, particularly for repeat offenders with a history of extreme violence. They argued that cases like Rodriguez proved that certain criminals were beyond rehabilitation and that the law needed to reflect that reality. Others, however, warned against reactionary policies, cautioning that changing sentencing laws based on one notorious case could lead to broader consequences, potentially resulting in overly harsh punishments for lesser crimes. Meanwhile, Rodriguez's notoriety continued to grow. He had already been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless media reports, but his 2011 arrest renewed public interest in his life. He had once claimed to be reformed, even speaking to reporters about how he regretted his past. Now that claim seemed laughable. If he had truly changed, why had he been caught up in criminal activity once again? His public persona was deeply unsettling. Unlike many criminals who avoided media attention, Rodriguez seemed to embrace it. He had given numerous interviews where he spoke openly about his past crimes, often with a chilling lack of remorse. In some cases, he even smiled as he recounted his killings, as if reminiscing about past glories rather than confessing to brutal murders. This only added to the perception that he was not just dangerous, but completely detached from normal human emotions. As his trial approached, legal analysts speculated on what would happen next. Given his history, prosecutors were expected to push for the maximum possible sentence, arguing that Rodriguez was too dangerous to be allowed back into society. But many feared that the legal system, bound by its own limitations, might once again fail to keep him behind bars permanently. Some believed Rodriguez thrived on the attention, that he enjoyed being seen as a larger-than-life figure. In a way, he had created his own mythology. The killer who only targeted criminals, the man who saw himself as delivering justice in a world that had failed to do so. But beneath that persona was a brutal reality. He was a man who had taken dozens of lives, a man who had continued to kill even when locked away, and a man who, despite claiming to be reformed, had once again found himself at the center of a criminal case. His rearrest did not answer the question of whether he could ever truly change. Instead, it reinforced the belief that some people are simply wired for violence, that no amount of time behind bars can erase what they have become. Brazil's justice system had given Rodriguez a second chance, but what he did with that chance suggested that he had never really left his old life behind. As he sat in his cell, awaiting his fate, the country watched closely, wondering whether this time, finally, justice would be served. Story 3. On July 22, 2011, Norway experienced an unprecedented tragedy that would forever alter its national consciousness. Anders Behring Breivik, a 32-year-old Norwegian with far-right extremist views, orchestrated a two-part terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 77 individuals, marking it as the deadliest event on Norwegian soil since World War II. The sequence of terror commenced in the heart of Norway's capital, Oslo. At approximately 3:25 p.m., a massive explosion rocked the Regjeringskvartalet, the executive government quarter. Breivik had strategically placed a van loaded with a homemade fertilizer bomb, weighing about 950 kilograms, near the office of then Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg. The detonation resulted in the deaths of 8 people and caused extensive injuries to over 200 others, with 12 sustaining severe wounds. The blast inflicted significant structural damage to government buildings, shattering windows and sending debris flying across the vicinity. Panic ensued as emergency responders rushed to the scene, working frantically to rescue those trapped in the rubble and assist the wounded. In the immediate aftermath, speculation ran wild. Many initially suspected an international terrorist organization was responsible, given the scale and coordination of the attack. The Norwegian government activated emergency protocols, urging civilians to remain indoors while law enforcement secured key locations across the city. As rescue operations continued, intelligence agencies scrambled to assess whether further threats loomed. The air was thick with uncertainty, But what no one yet realized was that this attack was only the beginning. While authorities in Oslo focused on managing the devastation caused by the bombing, Breivik was already en route to the second phase of his plan. Disguised as a police officer, he drove to the island of Utøya, approximately 40 kilometers northwest of the capital. The island was hosting a summer camp for the Workers' Youth League, AUF, the youth wing of the Norwegian Labour Party. Hundreds of young people, many of them teenagers, had gathered there for political discussions, recreational activities, and leadership training. They were completely unaware that a nightmare was about to unfold. Shortly after arriving at the ferry dock near the island, Breivik calmly convinced security personnel to transport him to Utøya. Under the guise of conducting a routine security check following the Oslo bombing, he gained the trust of camp organizers. Once he set foot on the island, he revealed his true intentions. Without hesitation, he drew his firearms, a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle and a Glock pistol, and opened fire. The first victims fell within seconds, their bodies crumpling to the ground as panicked screams filled the air. Chaos erupted as campers ran in all directions, desperately seeking shelter from the relentless gunfire. Some attempted to hide in tents, while others fled toward the water, hoping to swim to safety. Breivik moved methodically, his expression cold and detached as he stalked his prey. Survivors later recounted how he taunted his victims, calling out to them in a falsely reassuring voice, only to execute them as soon as they emerged from hiding. He displayed no hesitation, no mercy, only an unshakable resolve to kill as many people as possible. For over an hour, the massacre continued. Calls for help flooded emergency hotlines, but communication issues and logistical challenges delayed law enforcement's response. The remote location of the island, combined with confusion from the ongoing crisis in Oslo, hindered a swift intervention. Meanwhile, Breivik roamed freely, executing those he found with chilling precision. The water surrounding the island became a desperate escape route for some, but even then, safety was not guaranteed. Survivors later described how he fired at those trying to swim away, their bodies vanishing beneath the surface of the fjord. As the gunfire persisted, Norway's elite police force, the Delta Force, was mobilized. Once on site, officers swiftly located Breivik, who, to their surprise, surrendered without resistance. He was taken into custody, his expression eerily calm, as if he had merely completed an objective. The nightmare had ended, but the scars it left on Norway would never fade. In the moments after Anders Behring Breivik's arrest, Norway stood in stunned silence. The scale of the violence was incomprehensible. The Oslo bombing had already sent shockwaves through the country, but the massacre on Utøya was beyond anything the nation had ever witnessed. Survivors, many of them young teenagers, emerged from their hiding places in a state of shock. Some were drenched, shivering from having swum across the fjord. Others were covered in blood, whether their own or that of their friends who had not been as fortunate. Parents who had sent their children to the summer camp expecting a weekend of political discussions and outdoor activities were now frantically calling their phones, desperate for answers that would not come quickly enough. The emergency response team worked tirelessly to secure the island and evacuate the wounded. Helicopters hovered over the site, their searchlights cutting through the growing darkness, while rescue boats combed the shoreline for survivors who had fled into the water. Ambulances lined up at the ferry dock, ready to transport the injured to hospitals across the region. Despite the chaos, medical personnel moved with precision, stabilizing victims and providing psychological support to those too traumatized to speak. Some survivors were unable to form coherent sentences, their bodies trembling from fear and exhaustion. Others broke down upon realizing the full extent of the tragedy, collapsing into the arms of strangers, their cries echoing across the water. Back in Oslo, news of the Utøya massacre spread rapidly. Norwegians, still reeling from the bombing in the capital, could hardly grasp that an even greater horror had unfolded just hours later. The media scrambled to piece together the timeline of events, initially speculating that the attacks were the work of an international terrorist organization. But as details emerged about Breivik's arrest, the narrative shifted. This was not the work of a foreign extremist group. This was the act of a Norwegian national, one of their own. As law enforcement began interrogating Breivik, the full extent of his meticulously planned attack became clear. He had spent years preparing for this day, stockpiling weapons and explosives, drafting a manifesto that outlined his extremist ideology, and carefully crafting a strategy to maximize casualties. He had chosen his targets deliberately, seeing the government quarter in Oslo, and the youth camp on Utøya as symbols of what he despised, a multicultural, liberal Norway that, in his eyes, had abandoned its national identity. His actions were not impulsive. They were the culmination of years of radicalization and resentment. Authorities searched Breivik's residence and uncovered a chilling array of evidence. His manifesto, a 1,500-page document titled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, detailed his beliefs and justification for the attacks. He viewed himself as a crusader against what he called the Islamization of Europe and blamed Norway's Labour Party for facilitating immigration policies that, in his view, threatened the country's cultural purity. The document was not just a personal diary of grievances. It was a call to arms, an attempt to inspire others to follow in his footsteps. Forensic analysts pieced together how Breivik had executed his plan. He had spent months acquiring the materials needed to build the bomb used in Oslo, purchasing fertilizer and chemicals under the guise of running a farming business. He had trained himself in weapons handling and tactics, ensuring that when the moment came, he would be able to carry out his attack with deadly efficiency. His choice to wear a police uniform on Utøya was not just a practical disguise. It was a psychological weapon. It made his victims hesitate, lowering their defenses just long enough for him to strike. Norwegian leaders, including Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, addressed the nation in the wake of the tragedy. Their message was clear: Norway would not be defined by hatred. Stoltenberg called for unity, urging citizens to respond to the attack not with vengeance, but with resilience and a commitment to democracy. The country, known for its peaceful society and emphasis on social cohesion, was determined not to let Breivik's ideology take root. Yet, even as the nation mourned, questions arose. How had Breivik managed to orchestrate such a large-scale attack without detection? Were there warning signs that had been ignored? Some critics pointed to the delays in the police response, particularly the time it took for the special forces to reach Utøya. The initial reports indicated that logistical challenges, including a lack of suitable transport and communication difficulties, had slowed the rescue operation. Others debated whether Norway's criminal justice system was equipped to handle an offender like Breivik. As the legal proceedings against him began, survivors and victims' families prepared for the long road ahead. They would have to relive the worst day of their lives in court, forced to listen as Breivik explained, without remorse, why he had committed the massacre. Some parents, devastated by the loss of their children, vowed to be present at every hearing, determined to ensure that their loved ones were not forgotten. The country braced itself for the painful but necessary process of seeking justice. The grief was immeasurable, but so was the strength of those left behind. As Norway came to terms with its darkest day, the resilience of its people shone through. Across the country, candlelight vigils were held in remembrance of the victims. Flowers covered city squares, and handwritten messages of love and unity lined the fences near the government buildings in Oslo. A movement emerged, not one of fear, but of defiance against the hatred that had fueled the attack. But even as Norway stood together in solidarity, one haunting question remained. Could something like this happen again? The nation had been unprepared for the horror of July 22, 2011. Now, it faced the daunting task of ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. As the trial of Anders Behring Breivik approached, Norway found itself at the center of a global debate. The world watched closely, not just because of the scale of the tragedy, but because of how Norway's justice system would handle a man who had committed the deadliest act of violence in the country's modern history. Norway prided itself on a legal framework that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. But what did rehabilitation mean for someone like Breivik? A man who had taken 77 lives in cold blood, a man who did not express a shred of remorse? Could justice truly be served in a system that did not believe in life imprisonment? Under Norwegian law, the maximum prison sentence for any crime, even mass murder, was 21 years. There was an exception, a provision called preventive detention, which allowed for indefinite extensions of a sentence if the prisoner was deemed a continuing threat to society. But for many Norwegians, even the possibility that Breivik could one day be released was deeply unsettling. Some families of the victims feared that in a country so committed to leniency, a loophole could someday set him free. Despite these concerns, Norway refused to compromise its principles. Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg made it clear: Norway would respond to terrorism not with vengeance, but with more democracy, more openness, and more love. In the months following the attack, the nation stood firm in its commitment to rejecting hatred. Thousands gathered for memorial services, singing songs of peace in direct defiance of Breivik's ideology. The message was clear: he had failed to divide them. If anything, he had only strengthened their unity. The trial began on April 16, 2012, drawing intense media attention. Breivik, dressed in a suit, entered the courtroom with a chilling lack of emotion. He smirked at times, offered a fascist salute, and remained disturbingly composed as he described his crimes in detail. His goal was not just to defend himself legally, he wanted a platform. He sought to justify his actions, to spread his extremist beliefs, to explain why he had targeted the government and the youth of the Labour Party. He wanted the world to listen, but Norway refused to give him what he wanted. The court proceedings, though necessary, did not amplify his voice the way he had hoped. Instead, survivors of the Utøya massacre took the stand, recounting their harrowing experiences. Some had hidden under beds or behind rocks as they listened to their friends being gunned down. Others described the agonizing decision to swim for their lives, knowing that those who could not keep up would drown. Parents of the victims spoke through tears, remembering the last phone calls they had received from their children, calls that ended with gunshots and silence. Breivik sat motionless as he listened. If he felt anything, he did not show it. He insisted that he did not regret his actions, claiming he had been fighting a war against multiculturalism, against immigration, against what he saw as the destruction of Europe's identity. His complete lack of remorse shocked even those who had braced themselves for the worst. Psychiatrists were called to evaluate his mental state. Their assessments became a focal point of the trial. The first team diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, which could have led to a verdict of criminal insanity, meaning he would be institutionalized rather than imprisoned. But a second team disagreed, concluding that he was fully responsible for his actions. The court ultimately ruled that he was sane and sentenced him to 21 years in prison, with the possibility of indefinite extensions. For many, the verdict was a formality. Given the nature of his crimes, it was widely expected that he would never be released. But the trial itself was symbolic. It reaffirmed Norway's commitment to justice, due process, and humanity, even in the face of unimaginable evil. Unlike the authoritarian regimes Breivik admired, Norway refused to abandon its values. Breivik was sent to Ila prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement. Despite his notoriety, he continued to seek attention. He filed lawsuits claiming that his prison conditions were inhumane, complaining that he did not have access to a PlayStation 3 and that his coffee was served cold. He argued that being held in isolation violated his human rights. His complaints were widely ridiculed, especially by the families of his victims, who would never again see their loved ones. Norway, however, did not dismiss his grievances outright. The court ruled that some aspects of his confinement did violate human rights regulations, though the ruling changed little about his actual imprisonment. He remained isolated with strict monitoring, his every move controlled. Even behind bars, he remained a specter in Norwegian society. The attack had left an indelible mark, forcing the country to re-examine its policies on extremism, law enforcement response times, and prison sentencing. Security measures were tightened, and efforts to counter radicalization increased. But the greatest change was cultural. The attack had instilled a collective determination to safeguard democracy and reject hate. Schools incorporated lessons on tolerance and the dangers of extremism. Survivors of the Utøya massacre went on to become political leaders, activists, and advocates for peace. A decade after the attack, Norway continued to remember. Every year, on July 22nd, memorials were held in Oslo and on Utøya, where names of the victims were read aloud. The island, once a place of horror, was reclaimed as a site of resilience. New generations of young Norwegians gathered there, carrying forward the ideals that Breivik had sought to destroy. The bullet holes were gone, but the memories remained. Breivik had sought to break Norway, to make it retreat in fear. Instead, Norway had shown that it could not be broken. The wounds he left behind would never fully heal, but the country had emerged stronger, its commitment to peace and democracy unshaken. He had wanted to be remembered as a warrior. Instead, he would be remembered only as a murderer, a man whose legacy would never be one of victory, but of failure. Story 4. In 2011, Taiwan's legal system was thrust into the international spotlight due to the prolonged and contentious case of Chu Ho-shun. Convicted of murder in 1989, Chu had spent over 2 decades on death row, with his case undergoing numerous retrials and appeals. Allegations of coerced confessions and judicial misconduct plagued the proceedings, raising profound questions about the integrity of Taiwan's justice system. The case began in 1987 when a 9-year-old boy was kidnapped and subsequently murdered. The crime shocked the nation, and under immense public pressure to find the perpetrator, authorities arrested Chu Hoshan along with several co-defendants. Chu was accused of being the mastermind behind the abduction and murder. Investigators claimed he had orchestrated the crime with the help of accomplices, seeking ransom from the boy's family. During police interrogations, Chu and his co-defendants were subjected to relentless questioning. Reports later surfaced that the confessions, which formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, were extracted through torture. Detainees were allegedly beaten, deprived of sleep, and threatened with execution if they refused to comply. Despite these claims, the confessions were accepted as evidence in court, leading to Chu's conviction and sentencing to death. His legal battle spanned decades. Human rights organizations, both within Taiwan and internationally, took notice of his case, arguing that the trial was fundamentally flawed. New evidence emerged suggesting that the forensic analysis used to link Chu to the crime was unreliable. Additionally, key witnesses recanted their testimonies, admitting they had been coerced into implicating him. Despite mounting concerns, Taiwan's judiciary remained resistant to overturning the conviction. Chu's appeals were repeatedly denied, and each time his execution was postponed, it was met with renewed debates about the fairness of the legal system. By 2011, the case had become one of Taiwan's most controversial, drawing comparisons to wrongful convictions in other parts of the world. As Chu continued to await his fate in solitary confinement, international pressure intensified. Amnesty International and other human rights groups urged the Taiwanese government to abolish the death penalty altogether, citing Chu's case as an example of how the system could lead to irreversible miscarriages of justice. The government, however, faced a dilemma. While global scrutiny called for reform, domestic sentiment largely supported the continuation of capital punishment, particularly in high-profile cases. The case of Chu Hoshan was more than just a legal battle. It was a test of Taiwan's evolving judicial principles, its stance on human rights, and the extent to which past injustices could be rectified. Even as legal experts dissected every aspect of the case, one question loomed over the proceedings. Had Taiwan sentenced an innocent man to die? As the years passed, Chu Hoshan's case became a symbol of Taiwan's struggle between its legal traditions and the growing international demand for human rights reforms. The controversy surrounding his conviction did not fade. Rather, it intensified with every legal challenge and every new revelation that suggested deep flaws in the judicial process. Lawyers and human rights advocates tirelessly worked to bring attention to the inconsistencies in the case, arguing that Chu had been convicted on evidence that would never hold up in a fair court of law. One of the most alarming aspects of the case was the complete reliance on confessions obtained through coercion. In multiple testimonies, Chu and his co-defendants detailed the horrific methods used to extract their statements. They described being blindfolded and handcuffed for long periods, deprived of sleep, and beaten repeatedly. Some recounted being electrocuted, their bodies convulsing in pain as interrogators demanded that they confess. Others spoke of psychological torture, of threats that their family members would be harmed if they did not comply. Chu himself maintained that he had held out for as long as he could, but after weeks of torment, he finally gave in. Despite the fact that Taiwan had begun making legal reforms to prevent coerced confessions from being used as primary evidence, Chu's conviction remained intact. The courts upheld their original ruling, stating that his confessions were consistent with the known details of the crime. His defense team, however, pointed out that much of the case against him was built on information provided by police, and that Chu's so-called confessions mirrored the details officers had already assumed to be true. When inconsistencies arose, they were either dismissed or ignored entirely. The forensic evidence was also highly questionable. Investigators had linked Chu to the crime using hair and fiber samples, but later reviews of the forensic process revealed serious errors. Experts who revisited the case years later found that the analysis had been conducted using outdated methods, and that none of the physical evidence definitively proved Chu's involvement. Additionally, a key piece of evidence, an alleged murder weapon, was found to have no verifiable connection to him. Yet, the courts remained firm in their decision, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility of a miscarriage of justice. Taiwan's judicial system was under immense pressure. If Chu's conviction was overturned, It would raise uncomfortable questions about how many other cases had been decided in similar fashion. For decades, confessions had been the cornerstone of criminal convictions in Taiwan, and if Chu's case were overturned, it could call into question the legitimacy of numerous past rulings. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was divided. Some believed Chu was guilty and that the courts had acted appropriately, while others viewed him as a victim of an outdated and deeply flawed system. His case became a rallying point for those advocating against the death penalty, with protests demanding not only his release but a complete overhaul of Taiwan's justice system. International organizations joined the calls for justice. Amnesty International, the Taiwan Association for Human Rights, and other advocacy groups petitioned the government to conduct a fair and transparent review of the case. They argued that as Taiwan sought to position itself as a modern democracy with respect for human rights, it could not afford to execute a man under such dubious circumstances. The European Union also weighed in, urging Taiwan to abolish the death penalty altogether. Despite the mounting criticism, the Taiwanese government was hesitant to act. The issue of capital punishment remained politically sensitive, and many officials feared that pardoning Chu would be seen as an admission of widespread judicial failure. However, with each passing year, the calls for reform grew louder, forcing the government to confront the reality that Chu's case was not simply going to disappear. Chu himself, now an aging man who had spent more than 2 decades in prison, expressed exhaustion but remained resolute in his claims of innocence. In interviews, he spoke about the years lost, about the pain of knowing that his fate had been decided by a system that refused to acknowledge its own mistakes. He described the isolation of death row, the uncertainty of waking up each morning not knowing whether it would be his last. His story resonated with many, sparking debates about Taiwan's death penalty system and whether it was truly equipped to deliver justice. More cases began emerging in which defendants had been convicted under questionable circumstances, some of whom had already been executed before new evidence came to light. By 2011, the world was watching Taiwan closely. The government could no longer ignore the growing demand for justice. Would Taiwan take the bold step of exonerating a man who had been sentenced under questionable circumstances, or would it uphold a conviction tainted by decades of legal misconduct? The nation stood at a crossroads, and the decision it made would have lasting implications for its justice system and its global reputation. As 2011 progressed, the pressure on Taiwan's legal system intensified. Activists, human rights organizations, and international observers continued to scrutinize Chu Hoshun's case, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies and raising serious concerns about whether the justice system had failed him. His defense team, exhausted but determined, filed yet another appeal, demanding a full reinvestigation. They argued that if Taiwan was to be recognized as a modern democracy that valued human rights, it could not ignore a case that so clearly represented the dangers of wrongful conviction. Despite the public outcry, the government remained hesitant to act. Taiwan's legal institutions, deeply rooted in precedent, were resistant to acknowledging such a fundamental mistake. To overturn Chu's conviction would mean admitting that the justice system had been complicit in a decades-long miscarriage of justice, one that had kept a man locked away in solitary confinement for more than 20 years, constantly awaiting the possibility of execution. It would mean recognizing that the confessions extracted through torture should never have been accepted as evidence, and that forensic science had been misused to justify an unjust sentence. Inside the prison, Chu Hoshun's life was one of routine and isolation. He had long since adapted to the confines of his small cell, but the psychological toll of knowing he could be executed at any moment weighed heavily on him. Over the years, he had watched as fellow death row inmates were led away, their sentences carried out swiftly and without warning. The knowledge that he could be next was a burden he had carried for decades. His survival, he believed, was no longer just about himself. It was about proving that Taiwan's justice system could still be held accountable. One of the most critical developments in his case came when new forensic analysis showed that the evidence originally used to convict him was unreliable. Independent experts reviewed the original findings and concluded that the forensic methods used at the time were not only outdated, but had been applied inconsistently. The hair and fiber samples that supposedly tied him to the crime scene had been improperly tested, and there was no concrete DNA evidence placing him at the scene. These findings further reinforced the belief that his conviction had been based on fabricated or coerced evidence. By this point, legal scholars and human rights activists were openly calling for a review of Taiwan's reliance on the death penalty. They cited Chu's case as the strongest example of why capital punishment should be abolished. If an innocent man could be executed due to flawed evidence and coerced confessions, then the system itself was too dangerous to continue. However, many in Taiwan still viewed the death penalty as necessary for the worst crimes, and any attempt to abolish it faced significant political resistance. Despite these challenges, Chu's case began to shift public perception. The idea that a man could be sentenced to death without irrefutable evidence unsettled many. Protests demanding judicial reform became more frequent, and media coverage of his case brought renewed attention to Taiwan's broader issues with wrongful convictions. Investigations into past cases revealed that Chu was not alone. Other prisoners had been convicted under similarly questionable circumstances, some of whom had already been executed before the flaws in their cases were discovered. The legal battle continued, with the courts still reluctant to overturn the conviction. Some judges argued that, despite the inconsistencies, the legal process had already been exhausted. Others feared that exonerating Chu would open the floodgates for appeals in numerous other cases, creating a crisis of credibility for Taiwan's judiciary. But as international pressure mounted, the government was forced to reconsider its stance. In late 2011, Taiwan's judicial authorities announced that they would conduct a formal review of the case. While this was not an immediate exoneration, it was the first real acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. The government also announced broader legal reforms, including new protections against coerced confessions and increased scrutiny of forensic evidence. While these changes came too late for many who had suffered under the previous system, they represented a step toward preventing future injustices. Chu Hoshun's case continued to drag on, with legal motions and bureaucratic delays preventing a swift resolution. But the tide was turning. More legal experts and politicians began speaking out in his favor, calling for his immediate release. By the end of the year, the pressure was undeniable. Taiwan could no longer afford to ignore the case. In the years that followed, Taiwan would continue to wrestle with the implications of Chu's wrongful conviction. His case became one of the most well-documented miscarriages of justice in the country's history, serving as a cautionary tale of what happens when the legal system prioritizes expedience over fairness. Though justice had been delayed for decades, his story had ignited a movement, one that demanded accountability, reform, and above all, the recognition that no system is infallible. As 2011 came to a close, Chu remained behind bars, still fighting for the justice that had eluded him for so long. His fate was uncertain, but one thing was clear: his case had changed Taiwan forever. Story 5. Ong Soo-hoon, a 36-year-old woman, had always been known as quiet and reserved, a person who kept her emotions guarded even from those closest to her. She had spent years cultivating a life that seemed stable, working hard, maintaining friendships, and even venturing into business. But beneath that exterior, something festered. In 2011, Singapore was shaken by the news that she had committed an unthinkable crime, murdering her longtime friend and former lover, Celine Ng Sui Pung. What seemed like a friendship built on trust had unraveled into tragedy, exposing the deep fractures beneath their shared history. Ong and Ng first met in 1995 during their time at Nji and Polytechnic. Their friendship was immediate and deep, built on shared interests and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Over time, their connection grew beyond platonic affection, and in 2010, they entered into a brief romantic relationship. Though the romance eventually faded, they remained close, deciding to live together in a condominium at West Coast, Singapore. Both women were ambitious and hardworking. They had even started a cafe together in 2009, a venture that was short-lived due to their other commitments, but it spoke to their shared aspirations. Ng, a successful property agent, was known for her vivacious personality and relentless work ethic. Ong, who had a more reserved nature, worked diligently in her own field, though she rarely opened up about her personal struggles. Their relationship, while seemingly strong, had underlying tensions that few people noticed. In the months leading up to the murder, cracks in their dynamic became apparent. Close friends of Ng later revealed that she had been planning to move out, sensing that their friendship had become strained. Ong, however, seemed unwilling to let go. There were rumors of financial disputes, unresolved emotions from their past relationship, and even hints of jealousy. Though Ng had assured those around her that she could handle the situation, No one could have predicted the extent of the danger she was in. On the night of the murder, Ang's behavior took a drastic turn. Witnesses recalled her appearing unusually tense in the days prior, withdrawing from conversations and avoiding social interactions. Inside the walls of their condominium, an argument erupted, one that escalated far beyond mere words. By the time neighbors heard the muffled sounds of struggle, it was too late. When authorities arrived, Ing was found lifeless, her body bearing the marks of a violent attack. Ong, the woman who had once been her closest companion, stood in shock, her hands stained with the irreversible consequences of her actions. The investigation into Celine Ng Sui Peng's murder sent shockwaves through Singapore. The case was not just about the crime itself, but about the unraveling of a relationship that had once seemed unbreakable. What had pushed Ong Soo-hoon to commit such an act? Was it premeditated, or had something inside her finally snapped? The police worked tirelessly to piece together the final moments leading up to the crime, combing through text messages, financial records, and witness statements to understand the motive behind the killing. Those who knew both women struggled to reconcile the image of Ong as a quiet, hard-working individual with that of a murderer. She had never shown any outward signs of aggression. Even in times of stress, she was known to retreat inward rather than lash out. But those closest to Ing began to reveal that their relationship had been deteriorating for months, possibly even years. The tension had been subtle at first, disagreements over household expenses, missed conversations, and increasing emotional distance. However, behind closed doors, things were far worse than anyone had imagined. One of Eng's friends, a colleague at the real estate firm where she worked, later told police that Ing had confided in her about wanting to move out. She had mentioned feeling suffocated, as though she was being controlled in ways she didn't fully understand. While Ing never described Ong as violent, there were moments that made her uneasy. Long silences, passive-aggressive remarks, an underlying resentment that seemed to build over time. She had delayed moving out, partly out of convenience and partly because she didn't want to cause unnecessary conflict. But those closest to her believed she had underestimated the intensity of Ang's emotions. Police uncovered financial disputes between the two women. Their previous business venture, the cafe they had opened together in 2009, had left lingering issues. Though the business had been sold, there were questions about money, who had contributed more, who had taken financial risks, and whether there were still unresolved debts between them. Ing was financially independent, thriving in her career, while Ong seemed to struggle. Friends noticed that Ong had become increasingly withdrawn, even resentful at times. While she never explicitly blamed Ing for her frustrations, there was an underlying bitterness that could not be ignored. The night of the murder, security footage showed Ing entering their condominium around 9:30 p.m. Less than an hour later, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like furniture being knocked over, followed by muffled shouting. These sounds were not unusual in apartment complexes, and no one thought much of it at the time. But what they had dismissed as a minor dispute would later prove to be the final moments of Eng's life. Ong later told investigators that the argument had started over something trivial, an unpaid bill, an old disagreement resurfacing. But as tensions rose, years of suppressed emotions came boiling to the surface. Ing, frustrated, may have finally voiced her decision to leave for good. To Ong, this may have felt like a final betrayal, an abandonment that she could not accept. At some point, the argument turned physical. The injuries found on Eng's body suggested a prolonged struggle. There were defensive wounds on her arms and hands, indicating that she had fought back. Blood was found in multiple areas of the apartment, suggesting that the altercation had moved from one room to another. Ong, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, had overpowered her friend, delivering fatal blows that ended Eng's life. By the time the police arrived, alerted by a worried neighbor who had finally decided to check on the disturbance, the apartment was eerily silent. Ong was found sitting on the floor, her expression vacant. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she resist arrest. It was as if the gravity of what she had done had only just settled in. When questioned, her responses were detached, almost robotic. She admitted to killing Ing but struggled to articulate why. She described feeling overwhelmed, as if something inside her had broken, leaving her unable to stop herself. Investigators knew that this was not a random act of violence. This was personal. This was the culmination of years of unresolved tension, of emotions that had been left to fester until they could no longer be contained. But whether Ong had intended to kill Ing that night, or whether it had been an explosion of uncontrolled rage, remained a critical question. As forensic teams examined the crime scene, they found further evidence of premeditation. A knife, wiped clean, was placed back in its drawer. Blood-stained clothing had been hastily discarded in the laundry basket. These small details suggested that after the killing, Ong had taken deliberate steps to compose herself, if only for a moment. Had she planned this all along? Or had she simply been acting on instinct, trying to clean up the mess in a desperate attempt to regain control? The answers were unclear, but one fact remained undeniable. Celine Sui Peng was dead, and Ong Soo-hoon was responsible. Now all that was left was for the legal system to determine the extent of her guilt and what punishment she would face. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. Ong Soo-hoon sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, her face unreadable. It had been months since her arrest, and in that time, psychologists had evaluated her, prosecutors had built their case, and the media had turned her into a figure of both fascination and horror. The woman who had once been seen as reserved, even unremarkable, was now infamous for the brutal killing of her closest friend. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their argument in painstaking detail. They painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy, resentment, and fear of abandonment. They spoke of the financial disputes, the growing emotional distance, and Ang's inability to let go of the one person who had been her constant for over a decade. Witnesses were called to testify about Ang's plans to move out, and how Ong had reacted poorly to the idea. The prosecution emphasized how Ong had a history of suppressing emotions until they exploded in ways no one had expected. Evidence from the crime scene was presented. Photos of the bloodstains, the overturned furniture, the defensive wounds on Ang's body. The prosecution argued that this was not an accident or a crime of passion committed in a single moment of rage. Instead, they suggested that Ong had been thinking about this for some time, possibly even planning it. They pointed to how she had tried to wipe the knife clean, how she had changed her clothes, and how, in the moments after the killing, she had simply sat there, waiting for reality to set in. These were the actions of someone who, at least in part, understood what they had done. The defense, however, presented a very different narrative. They described Ong as a woman struggling with deep-seated psychological issues, someone who had been emotionally dependent on Ing for years, and who had snapped when faced with the reality of losing her. They called upon psychologists who had evaluated her mental state and argued that she had not acted with premeditation, but rather had been overwhelmed by years of unresolved emotions. They claimed that Ong had suffered from depression and emotional instability, factors that impaired her ability to think rationally in the moment. Throughout the trial, Ong herself remained largely silent. When she did speak, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. She expressed remorse, though the prosecution argued that it was more regret for getting caught than true sorrow for what she had done. She never tried to justify her actions, but when asked why she did it, she struggled to answer. "I don't know," she said at one point. "I just lost control." The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the arguments carefully. The prosecution had painted her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had thought about her crime before carrying it out. The defense, on the other hand, had framed her as a deeply troubled woman who had acted impulsively, without the clear intent to kill. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. Ong Soo-hoon was convicted of culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. The judge, taking into account her mental state and lack of prior criminal history, sentenced her to 18 years in prison. It was not the life sentence the prosecution had sought, but it was enough to ensure that she would not walk free anytime soon. For many, the case was a painful reminder of how even the closest relationships can turn toxic, how emotions left unchecked can spiral into something deadly. Eng's family and friends were devastated, struggling to comprehend how someone she had trusted could have taken her life. Many believed the sentence was too lenient, that justice had not been fully served. Others, however, saw it as a tragic case of mental illness and emotional breakdown, a situation where there were no real winners. In the aftermath of the trial, conversations about mental health, domestic disputes, and the complexities of human relationships became more prevalent in Singaporean society. It was a case that highlighted the dangers of emotional dependency, the warning signs of a relationship breaking down, and the devastating consequences of suppressing unresolved anger. As the years passed, Ang's name faded from the headlines. She served her sentence quietly, rarely speaking to the media or making any appeals. When she was finally released, she disappeared from public view, her life forever marked by the crime she had committed. But for those who had known Ing, for those who had followed the case, the memory of what had happened in that West Coast condominium never truly faded. It remained a chilling example of how love, trust, and resentment could intertwine in the most tragic of ways. Story 6. Matthew Molinas, a 17-year-old student at College Sevenol, carried with him a dark past that few knew about. Behind his quiet and intelligent demeanor was a history of violent tendencies, a side of him that had already surfaced before. In 2010, he had been convicted of sexual assault against another young girl, but due to his age, he was granted a second chance, one that would prove to be a fatal mistake. Authorities allowed him to continue his education at the prestigious private school in Luchambon-sur-Lignon, a decision that would lead to the brutal rape and murder of 13-year-old Agnes Marin in 2011. The school, known for its progressive approach to education, welcomed students from diverse backgrounds. It was a place meant to foster growth, community, and second chances. Matthew fit in well, at least on the surface. Teachers described him as intelligent, though somewhat distant. He did not form many close friendships, but he wasn't seen as a troublemaker either. No one at the school knew of his past offense. His parents had fought to keep it a secret, believing that he deserved to move on from his mistakes without the burden of his past following him. Agnes Marin, on the other hand, was full of life. She was well-liked, bright, and had an enthusiasm that made her stand out among her peers. She had been attending College Sevenol for only a short time, but had already made many friends. On the surface, she and Matthew had little reason to cross paths, yet fate had a cruel way of bringing them together. On the evening of November 16, 2011, Matthew invited Agnes and a small group of friends to join him for a walk in the nearby woods. The students often explored the area together, enjoying the freedom that came with boarding school life. At some point during the walk, Matthew convinced Agnes to stay behind with him while the others returned to campus. What happened next would remain a haunting mystery, pieced together only through forensic evidence and Matthew's eventual confession. Agnes's absence was quickly noticed. When she failed to return to school that night, her friends raised the alarm. Teachers and students searched for her, their concern growing by the hour. By the next morning, the police were called in, and the search intensified. It wasn't long before suspicion fell on Matthew. He had been the last person seen with Agnes, and his behavior was increasingly erratic. When questioned, his answers were evasive, and inconsistencies began to emerge. The authorities pressed him harder, and under pressure, he finally broke. He led them to a secluded spot deep in the woods where they found Agnes's lifeless body. The scene was horrifying. Agnes had been raped and brutally murdered, her body left hidden beneath leaves and branches, as if Matthew had tried to cover up his crime in a moment of panic. The evidence against him was overwhelming: DNA samples, bloodstains, and his own admission of guilt. His prior conviction for sexual assault, which had been sealed from the school's knowledge, now came to light, sparking outrage across the country. People questioned how someone with such a history had been allowed to re-enter society so easily, and whether the justice system had failed not only Agnes, but also Matthew himself. As the case unfolded, it became clear that this was not an act of impulse. Matthew had lured Agnes into the woods with the intention of harming her. His past offense had been dismissed as an isolated incident, but in reality, it had been a warning that had gone unheeded. Now, a young girl was dead, and a community was left grappling with the horrifying realization that this tragedy could have been prevented. The revelation of Matthew Molinas's past ignited a firestorm of controversy across France. The fact that he had been previously convicted of sexual assault, but was still permitted to enroll in a school without oversight, was seen as a massive failure of the system. Parents of other students at College Sevenol were outraged, demanding answers from the school administration. How had a known offender been allowed to study alongside their children without anyone being informed? The reality was chilling. Matthew had been given a second chance, but at the cost of an innocent life. As police continued their investigation, more disturbing details emerged. Matthew had not only planned his attack, but he had also taken calculated steps to cover his tracks. Forensic evidence suggested that he had brought a weapon with him that night, an indication that his intentions had been set long before Agnes ever followed him into the woods. Text messages and online activity from the days leading up to the crime hinted at his growing obsession with violent fantasies. He had searched for information about past crimes, read articles on forensic techniques, and even watched videos on how to dispose of evidence. These findings painted a picture of a deeply disturbed young man who had been building up to this moment long before it happened. The night Agnes disappeared, several students recalled seeing Matthew return to campus alone. His demeanor had changed. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Some noticed he had scratches on his hands, though when asked, he brushed them off as nothing. No one suspected the horrific truth until it was too late. The school, trying to control the damage, issued a statement expressing deep regret over the incident. They claimed they had no knowledge of Matthew's prior offense, that they had trusted the recommendations from his previous institution and the assurances of his family. But for many, this excuse was not enough. There had been no safety measures in place, no background checks conducted. A known predator had been placed in an environment full of potential victims, and no one had done anything to prevent it. The media latched onto the case, and soon it became a national scandal. News outlets dissected every detail, from Matthew's childhood to the policies that had allowed him to reintegrate into society so easily. The justice system itself came under scrutiny. Why had his prior offense not resulted in stricter measures? Should he have been under supervision? Should he have even been free at all? These questions fueled heated debates, with some arguing that juvenile offenders deserved rehabilitation, while others insisted that some crimes should permanently bar individuals from re-entering society without strict monitoring. Matthew's family, too, faced intense public backlash. His parents, who had fought to keep his past secret, now found themselves accused of enabling his crime. Interviews with relatives and acquaintances revealed conflicting perspectives. Some described him as a troubled but intelligent boy who had struggled with emotions he couldn't control. Others painted a far more sinister picture, one of a manipulative individual who had learned how to mask his true nature until the opportunity for violence presented itself again. As the trial loomed, Matthew himself remained largely silent. He was held in a detention center, undergoing psychological evaluations to determine whether he had acted out of mental illness or calculated intent. Some reports suggested he showed little remorse, while others described moments where he appeared to break down in private. Yet, when questioned directly, he failed to offer any clear explanation for why he had done what he did. "I don't know," he reportedly told one investigator. "I just wanted to see what it felt like." Those words haunted everyone involved in the case. They suggested a level of detachment that made the crime all the more terrifying. This wasn't just a crime of passion or an act of desperation. It was something far more chilling. A calculated decision. An experiment in cruelty. And because no one had stopped him before, he had done it again. Matthew Molina sat in the courtroom, his expression unreadable as the judge read the charges against him. The weight of the crime was evident in the room. Agnes Marin's family sat in silence, their faces pale, their grief visible in every restrained breath they took. Across from them, Matthew's parents looked equally devastated, but the public had little sympathy for them. They had fought to shield their son from the consequences of his past, and now, an innocent girl had paid the price. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They detailed how Matthew had lured Agnes into the woods, how he had raped her, how he had strangled her until her body went limp. They showed photographs of the crime scene, disturbing images of leaves stained with blood, her lifeless body partially concealed beneath dirt and branches. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from his clothing matched Agnes's blood. Scratch marks on his hands and arms indicated that she had fought back. His internet search history suggested that he had researched similar crimes in the weeks leading up to the attack. Despite all of this, Matthew showed little reaction. His defense team attempted to argue that he had acted out of an untreated psychological disorder, that he had not fully understood the consequences of his actions. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Matthew displayed signs of antisocial personality disorder, but the prosecution countered that a diagnosis did not absolve him of responsibility. He had known what he was doing. He had covered up his crime. He had tried to lie when questioned. This was not the act of someone who had lost control. This was the act of a predator. Agnes's family was given the opportunity to speak. Her parents took the stand, their voices trembling as they described the bright, loving daughter who had been taken from them. Her mother clutched a photograph of Agnes as she spoke, her hands shaking. "She trusted him," she said. "We trusted this school. We trusted the people who were supposed to protect her. And now she's gone." The words hung in the air, leaving an unbearable silence in the courtroom. Outside, the case had ignited public outrage. Demonstrators gathered in front of the courthouse, demanding stricter laws for juvenile offenders. The debate over whether young criminals should be given second chances raged on. Some argued that Matthew had been failed by the system just as much as Agnes had. Others insisted that certain crimes should permanently mark a person as a danger to society, regardless of their age. The trial lasted several weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of rape and murder. The judge sentenced Matthew to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. It was the harshest sentence possible for someone his age, but for many, it still didn't feel like justice. Agnes's life had been cut short at 13. Matthew, even in prison, would live far longer than she ever would. Years later, the case remained a haunting reminder of the consequences of failing to recognize danger in time. It led to policy changes regarding background checks for students with criminal histories, but for Agnes's family, no reform could bring back their daughter. Matthew Molina's name faded from headlines, but Agnes's memory remained. In Unsettling, a small memorial was built in her honor, a quiet reminder of a young life stolen too soon. Story 7. George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old man, lived in the gated community of the Retreat at Twin Lakes in Sanford, Florida. He was the coordinator of the Neighborhood Watch program in the area and frequently reported what he perceived as suspicious activity to the police. On the night of February 26, 2012, he was inside his vehicle when he spotted a teenage boy walking through the neighborhood. The boy was Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old who was visiting his father's fiancée and had just returned from a nearby convenience store, carrying a can of iced tea and a bag of Skittles. Zimmerman, armed with a legally owned handgun, called the non-emergency police line to report what he described as a suspicious individual. He noted that the teenager was wearing a hoodie and walking slowly, appearing to look around. The dispatcher asked if he was following the boy, and when Zimmerman confirmed, he was advised not to pursue him. Despite this instruction, Zimmerman exited his vehicle. What happened next remains a matter of debate, with conflicting accounts and a lack of clear eyewitness testimony. At some point, Zimmerman and Martin engaged in a physical altercation. Nearby residents heard shouting, a struggle, and a single gunshot. When police arrived, they found Trayvon Martin lying face down on the ground, fatally shot in the chest. Zimmerman, who had a bloody nose and injuries to the back of his head, claimed he had acted in self-defense. Law enforcement officers initially did not arrest Zimmerman, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows the use of deadly force if a person feels their life is in danger. The decision not to charge him immediately sparked national outrage, with many believing that racial bias played a role in the handling of the case. Martin was unarmed, and his family, along with civil rights activists, demanded justice, arguing that Zimmerman had racially profiled him and instigated the confrontation. As the case gained media attention, protests erupted across the country, calling for Zimmerman's arrest. The phrase "Justice for Trayvon" became a rallying cry, and public figures, including then-President Barack Obama, addressed the controversy, further fueling the national conversation on race and self-defense laws in America. Weeks later, following public pressure and further investigation, Zimmerman was finally charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter. His trial would become one of the most highly publicized criminal cases in recent American history, dividing public opinion and raising crucial questions about race, gun laws, and the criminal justice system. The trial of George Zimmerman, which began in June 2013, became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent American history. In the courtroom, prosecutors argued that Zimmerman had racially profiled Trayvon Martin and acted as a vigilante, instigating the confrontation that led to the teenager's death. They painted a picture of Zimmerman as an overzealous neighborhood watch volunteer who ignored police instructions and pursued Martin, leading to a deadly encounter. The prosecution contended that Martin, who was unarmed, was simply walking back to the home where he was staying when Zimmerman confronted him, setting off a tragic chain of events. Zimmerman's defense team, however, maintained that their client had acted in self-defense. They argued that Martin had attacked Zimmerman first, knocking him to the ground and striking him repeatedly. To support this claim, they pointed to injuries on Zimmerman's head and face, which they said were consistent with him having been pinned to the ground and beaten. They also emphasized Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law, which allowed individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believed they were in imminent danger of serious harm or death. The case relied heavily on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and a single, chilling 911 call that captured the moments leading up to the shooting. In the recording, Desperate cries for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. One of the key questions in the trial was whether the voice calling for help was Zimmerman's or Martin's. Martin's family insisted that the cries belonged to Trayvon, pleading for his life. Zimmerman's defense team countered that it was their client, fighting for his survival as he was being attacked. The lack of definitive forensic proof left the jury to rely on their interpretation of the evidence. Another crucial moment in the trial was the testimony of Rachel Jeantel, a close friend of Trayvon Martin, who had been on the phone with him just moments before the shooting. She recounted that Martin had told her he was being followed by a creepy-ass cracker, and that he was scared. Her testimony, however, was scrutinized due to inconsistencies in her statements, and her credibility was attacked by the defense. Throughout the trial, the defense sought to portray Martin as a potential aggressor, pointing to traces of marijuana found in his system and past incidents of misbehavior at school. The prosecution, however, argued that these details were irrelevant and that Martin had been an innocent teenager simply walking home when he was confronted and ultimately killed. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case had transcended the courtroom. It had become a symbol of deeper societal issues in the United States, reigniting debates about racial profiling, gun control, and self-defense laws. Across the country, protests and demonstrations continued, with activists and celebrities wearing hoodies in solidarity with Trayvon Martin and calling for justice. The case also led to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which would go on to play a major role in advocating for racial justice in the years to come. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury, a panel of 6 women, 5 of whom were white, delivered their verdict. The nation held its breath as the decision was read in court. Zimmerman was found not guilty of both second-degree murder and manslaughter. The ruling shocked and angered many, while others saw it as a justified application of the law. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with demonstrators decrying what they saw as a failure of the justice system to hold Zimmerman accountable for taking an unarmed teenager's life. Despite being acquitted, Zimmerman's life would never be the same. He remained a highly controversial figure, frequently making headlines for further legal troubles and public altercations. Meanwhile, Trayvon Martin's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, became prominent activists, using their son's death as a catalyst to push for changes in racial justice and gun laws. The case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman left a lasting impact on American society, exposing deep divides in public opinion about race, self-defense, and the legal system. Even years later, the tragedy continues to be referenced in discussions about racial inequality and policing in the United States. It was more than just a courtroom battle. It was a moment that forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. Even after the trial concluded, the effects of the Zimmerman case rippled across the United States, leaving a lasting mark on the nation's legal and cultural landscape. The acquittal of George Zimmerman sparked an emotional response from communities across the country. While some defended the verdict as a fair application of the law, many others saw it as an injustice, reinforcing the idea that young black men in America were often criminalized even when they were the victims. Protests erupted in major cities, from New York to Los Angeles, with thousands taking to the streets demanding reform and accountability. The ruling also led to urgent discussions about the Stand Your Ground law, which had played a pivotal role in Zimmerman's defense. Florida's law, like similar laws in over 20 other states, allows individuals to use deadly force if they believe they are in imminent danger, without a duty to retreat. Critics of the law argued that it disproportionately harmed black Americans, giving legal cover to those who killed unarmed individuals under the guise of self-defense. In response, efforts were made to challenge and reform such laws, but opposition from gun rights advocates and conservative lawmakers prevented any significant legislative changes in most states. In the wake of Zimmerman's acquittal, Trayvon Martin's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They launched the Trayvon Martin Foundation, dedicated to raising awareness about gun violence and racial profiling. Sabrina Fulton, in particular, became a prominent advocate for social justice, speaking at events and working to prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. She often shared how she had never imagined that her son's death would spark a nationwide movement, but she was determined to turn the tragedy into a force for change. Meanwhile, Zimmerman himself became a highly controversial and polarizing figure. Although he had been acquitted, he struggled to maintain a private life and frequently found himself in legal trouble. In the years following the trial, he had multiple run-ins with the law, including arrests for domestic violence and aggressive behavior. He also stirred further outrage by attempting to profit from his notoriety, auctioning off the gun he used to kill Trayvon Martin and making inflammatory statements in interviews. Perhaps one of the most profound consequences of the case was its role in igniting the Black Lives Matter movement. While concerns about racial injustice in America had long existed, the killing of Trayvon Martin and the subsequent acquittal of Zimmerman galvanized activists and inspired a new wave of grassroots organizing. The phrase Black Lives Matter first emerged as a social media hashtag in 2013, but quickly grew into a national movement demanding justice for Black Americans killed by police and vigilantes. The movement gained further momentum with subsequent cases, such as the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York. Trayvon Martin's story also became a defining moment for political leaders, celebrities, and cultural influencers. Then President Barack Obama addressed the case in deeply personal terms, saying, "Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago." His remarks underscored the reality that many Black Americans saw their own lives reflected in Trayvon's fate. The case also influenced public figures in sports and entertainment, from LeBron James and his Miami Heat teammates wearing hoodies in solidarity to musicians referencing Martin in their lyrics. Over the years, Trayvon Martin's legacy continued to shape conversations about race and justice in America. His parents wrote books, attended conferences, and met with other families who had lost loved ones to gun violence. Their advocacy led to scholarships and initiatives aimed at providing opportunities for young Black men, ensuring that their son's name would not be forgotten. The legal system, however, remained slow to change. Despite growing demands for reform, cases similar to Trayvon Martin's continued to emerge, with unarmed Black individuals being killed under circumstances eerily reminiscent of that fateful night in 2012. The debates over self-defense laws, racial profiling, and policing remain deeply divisive, with no clear resolution in sight. More than a decade later, the name Trayvon Martin still evokes strong emotions, symbolizing the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice in America. His death was not just the loss of a 17-year-old boy, but a catalyst that forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about its legal system, its biases, and its values. The pain of his family, the protests that followed, and the movement that arose in his name are reminders that history is shaped not just by the powerful, but also by those who refuse to let injustice go unanswered. Even now, Trayvon Martin's hoodie, the Skittles in his pocket, and the iced tea he carried remain haunting symbols of a life taken too soon. His story, though tragic, continues to inspire new generations to fight for a world where no one is judged, pursued, or killed simply because of the color of their skin. Story 8. Art Bridger, a 46-year-old former slaughterhouse worker, lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of Mackinac, Wales. He was known around town, often seen engaging in odd jobs and socializing in local pubs. To some, he appeared as a friendly, helpful man. To others, he had a darker, more unsettling presence. He had a history of failed relationships, a tendency to fabricate stories about his past, and an obsession with young girls. His computer was later found to contain disturbing images, including violent child abuse material, making it clear that his intentions had been far more sinister than anyone had imagined. On October 1, 2012, in the quiet market town of Mackinac, Bridger spotted 5-year-old April Jones playing near her home. She had been outside riding her pink bicycle with friends, enjoying the last moments of daylight. Her family lived in a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, and children were often allowed to play freely without fear. That evening, as the children laughed and played near their homes, a vehicle approached them. Witnesses later described seeing a man in a Land Rover speaking to April. Moments later, she willingly got into the car. To her young friends, it didn't seem alarming. Perhaps he was a family friend or someone she knew. But April never returned home. When her parents, Coral and Paul Jones, realized she was missing, panic set in. They immediately searched the area, calling her name, knocking on neighbors' doors, and hoping she had simply wandered off. When there was no sign of her, they contacted the police, triggering one of the largest search operations in British history. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers gathered to help, scouring fields, rivers, and wooded areas, desperate to find any trace of the little girl. The investigation quickly turned to Bridger. His vehicle matched the description given by the children who had seen April get into the car. When police arrived at his home, they found him attempting to destroy evidence. His fireplace contained ashes and burnt fragments that would later be identified as belonging to April. Blood matching her DNA was found inside his home, along with a disturbing collection of images on his computer. Despite overwhelming evidence, Bridger refused to reveal what had happened to April. He initially claimed he had accidentally run her over and could not remember what he did with her body, but forensic evidence contradicted his story. Investigators believed he had lured her into his car with the intent to assault her, killed her shortly after, and then disposed of her body in a way that ensured it would never be found. The search for April continued for months. Thousands of people, from police officers to local volunteers, combed through dense forests, riverbanks, and remote landscapes, hoping for a miracle. The town of Mackinac, once a peaceful and safe community, was consumed by grief and horror. Ribbons, candles, and pictures of April filled the town as her parents clung to the hope that they would find her. But as the days turned into weeks, it became painfully clear that April was never coming home. The case sent shockwaves through the UK, igniting debates on child safety, sex offender monitoring, and the dark corners of the internet where predators like Bridger lurked. The nation watched in sorrow as the trial began, hoping for justice for April and her devastated family. The trial of Mark Bridger, which began in April 2013, was one of the most emotionally charged and heartbreaking cases in recent British history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public, all awaiting answers to the horrifying mystery that had shaken the nation. At the center of it all were April Jones's grieving parents, Coral and Paul Jones, who sat through the proceedings with quiet dignity, their faces etched with the pain of losing their daughter in such a brutal and senseless manner. The prosecution presented a chilling case against Bridger, revealing details that painted a disturbing portrait of a man whose actions had been deliberate and premeditated. They argued that Bridger, a former slaughterhouse worker with a history of violent tendencies, had targeted April as part of his growing obsession with young girls. His computer, which had been seized during the investigation, contained hundreds of images of child abuse, including photographs of April herself, taken from her family's social media pages before her abduction. There were also disturbing searches related to child murder cases, including those of notorious killers who had targeted young victims in the past. Forensic evidence played a crucial role in the trial. Despite Bridger's claim that he had accidentally run over April and had no memory of what happened next, blood matching April's DNA was found in his living room, along with bone fragments in his fireplace. Experts testified that these remains were consistent with the partial burning of a human child's body. Investigators also found knives and cutting tools in Bridger's home, further strengthening the argument that April had been murdered there. The prosecution believed he had abducted her with the intent of sexually assaulting her before ultimately killing her to avoid being caught. Bridger, however, stuck to his story. He claimed that he had no recollection of disposing of April's body and suggested that he might have blocked out the memory due to trauma. His defense team tried to argue that he had not planned the abduction and that her death had been an accident, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His erratic behavior before and after April's disappearance, the disturbing content found on his computer, and the bloodstains in his home all pointed to a man who had not only committed an unspeakable crime, but had also taken deliberate steps to cover it up. Throughout the trial, the public followed every detail with horror and outrage. People across the UK wore pink ribbons, the color associated with April, as a symbol of remembrance and solidarity with her family. The small town of Mackinac, once a quiet and peaceful community, had become the focal point of a tragedy that gripped the nation. Vigils were held in her honor, and donations poured in to support her devastated parents. The town's residents, still haunted by the search efforts that had gone on for months, struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that one of their own had committed such a horrific act. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was faced with a grim responsibility. They had to determine not only whether Bridger was guilty of murder, but also whether his crime had been premeditated. Given the overwhelming evidence, the outcome seemed inevitable, but for April's parents, nothing could ever truly bring them closure, not without knowing what had really happened to their daughter's body. Despite exhaustive searches, April's remains had never been fully recovered, and the thought of never being able to lay her to rest only deepened their anguish. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom fell silent. Mark Bridger was found guilty of abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, described Bridger as a manipulative and sadistic predator who had taken the life of an innocent child and then inflicted unimaginable suffering on her family by refusing to reveal where her body was. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to hear the news. While there was relief that justice had been served, the sense of loss remained. April Jones's murder had left a permanent scar on the community, and her parents would never get the answers they so desperately needed. The case had also sparked nationwide debates about child protection, internet safety, and how to prevent such tragedies in the future. The town of Mackinac would never be the same again. Pink ribbons continued to adorn its streets, a silent reminder of the little girl whose laughter had once filled the air. Though justice had been served, April's absence was felt in every home, in every playground, and in the hearts of those who had searched tirelessly to bring her back. Her name became a symbol of the need to protect the most vulnerable and to never forget the lives taken too soon by the darkest evils in society. Years after the trial, the impact of April Jones's abduction and murder remained deeply felt across Wales and the entire United Kingdom. Her family, still grieving the unbearable loss of their little girl, worked tirelessly to ensure that no other child would suffer a similar fate. They dedicated themselves to raising awareness about child protection, online safety, and the dangers lurking within seemingly safe communities. For Coral Jones, April's mother, the pain never faded, but she transformed her grief into a mission to fight for legislative changes and greater protections for children. One of the most significant consequences of April's case was the push for stricter regulations surrounding online child abuse material. During Bridger's trial, it became clear that his obsession with young girls had been fueled by the disturbing content he accessed online. This revelation sparked widespread public concern and demands for social media companies, internet providers, and law enforcement agencies to do more to monitor and restrict access to such harmful material. The UK government responded by strengthening laws on child pornography, increasing funding for cybercrime units, and implementing harsher penalties for those caught distributing or possessing illegal content. April's murder also led to renewed discussions about the dangers posed by individuals with a history of violent behavior. Bridger had a troubling past. While he had no prior convictions for serious crimes, he was known to have lied about his background, manipulated people, and exhibited troubling behavior towards young girls. After his conviction, there were calls for a more comprehensive system to track individuals with potential predatory tendencies before they could commit horrific crimes. Some proposed a new registry for those found in possession of child exploitation material, even if they had not yet committed a physical offense, arguing that early intervention could prevent future tragedies. Despite these policy changes, one painful truth remained: April's body was never fully recovered. This was one of the most agonizing aspects of the case for her family. While forensic evidence confirmed her death, the lack of a body meant that her parents never had the opportunity to lay her to rest properly. Search teams had scoured rivers, mountains, forests, and even drained parts of local reservoirs, but Bridger had disposed of her remains so thoroughly that only a few bone fragments were ever found in his fireplace. The knowledge that she had been destroyed in such a brutal manner haunted her loved ones, leaving an open wound that could never fully heal. Over time, Mackinac attempted to move forward. The town, once known for its beautiful landscapes and tight-knit community, would forever be associated with one of the most shocking crimes in British history. Residents, many of whom had taken part in the search for April, struggled with the memories of those dark days. Parents became more protective, children were watched more closely, and a sense of lost innocence lingered in the air. While life continued, the echoes of April's laughter, her love for playing outside, and the image of her riding her pink bicycle remained frozen in the hearts of those who had known her. To honor her memory, April's family and the community launched the April Jones Foundation, dedicated to educating families about child safety and preventing child exploitation. Schools across the UK invited Coral Jones to speak about April's story, and her efforts led to stronger policies in safeguarding children from potential predators. Public awareness campaigns encouraged parents to be vigilant about their children's online activity, ensuring that cases like April's would serve as warnings rather than mere tragedies. Meanwhile, Mark Bridger remained in prison, despised by fellow inmates and the public alike. His refusal to disclose the full truth about what he had done to April fueled ongoing anger and frustration. He was kept under high security due to the nature of his crimes, as child killers are often targeted by other prisoners. Some reports indicated that he had been attacked multiple times in prison, a grim fate for a man who had taken away the innocence of a child and shattered the lives of so many. The legacy of April Jones extended beyond her small town. Her case changed how missing children were reported, how law enforcement handled child abductions, and how the internet was policed for harmful content. In many ways, April became a symbol of the need to protect the vulnerable and the innocent. Her favorite color, pink, became a mark of remembrance, and every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people across the UK wore pink ribbons to honor her memory. For Coral and Paul Jones, life could never be the same. Their home, once filled with the sounds of April's laughter, now stood as a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. Yet, through their grief, they found strength to fight for change, ensuring that April's death would not be in vain. They continued to speak out, advocating for stronger laws and keeping their daughter's memory alive in every way they could. Time passed, but the wound remained fresh. Every year, on what should have been her birthday, her family lit candles, looked through old photos, and imagined the girl she would have become. They held on to the memory of her wide, joyful smile, the way she loved riding her bicycle, and the warmth of her hugs. Though April Jones was gone, she would never be forgotten. Her story, tragic and painful, had left an indelible mark on the world, serving as both a warning and a reminder of the darkness that exists, but also of the love, resilience, and determination that can emerge from even the deepest pain. Story 9. Peter Lim Sinpang had spent decades building a distinguished career in Singapore's civil service. As the Commissioner of the Singapore Civil Defence Force, SCDF, he was responsible for overseeing the nation's emergency response teams, including firefighting, rescue operations, and paramedic services. Known for his disciplined leadership and dedication, he had earned the trust of his colleagues and superiors. However, beneath his polished reputation, he was entangled in a web of corruption that would soon unravel, shaking the very foundations of Singapore's public service. In early 2012, an internal investigation by the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, revealed that Lim had abused his position for personal gain. The findings were damning. He had engaged in corrupt dealings with vendors who supplied equipment and services to the SCDF. In exchange for awarding lucrative contracts to specific companies, Lim had received personal favors, including lavish entertainment and sexual services. The scandal sent shockwaves across Singapore, a country known for its strict laws and zero tolerance for corruption. The case came to light when anonymous tips alerted authorities to irregularities in the procurement process within the SCDF. The CPIB launched an inquiry, scrutinizing Lim's connections with several private companies that provided technology and rescue equipment to the emergency services. Investigators discovered that he had granted preferential treatment to certain vendors in exchange for illicit benefits. The evidence against him included text messages, recorded meetings, and financial transactions that pointed to a pattern of corruption stretching over several years. As news of the investigation spread, public trust in Singapore's civil service was shaken. Government officials, typically held to the highest ethical standards, rarely faced allegations of misconduct, let alone corruption, at such a senior level. The revelation that a high-ranking officer like Lim had exploited his authority for personal pleasure was met with disbelief and outrage. Many questioned how such behavior had gone undetected for so long, and whether other officials were involved in similar schemes. Lim was arrested and charged with multiple counts of corruption. His trial, which would soon become one of the most closely watched legal battles in Singapore's recent history, promised to expose the hidden vulnerabilities in a system known for its transparency and accountability. As the case unfolded, more details about his misconduct emerged, painting a troubling picture of how a man entrusted with protecting the nation's citizens had instead prioritized his own selfish desires. His downfall was not just a personal tragedy, but a national embarrassment. Singapore prided itself on having one of the world's most efficient and corruption-free governments, and Lim's actions cast a shadow over the entire civil service. The case raised urgent questions about oversight mechanisms, internal audits, and the potential for abuse within even the most respected institutions. The trial was set to reveal the full extent of Lim's corruption, the companies complicit in his schemes, and the systemic weaknesses that had allowed such misconduct to persist undetected. As the prosecution gathered more evidence and key witnesses prepared to testify, Singapore braced itself for a courtroom battle that would leave a lasting mark on the country's fight against corruption. As the trial of Peter Lim Sin Peng began, the nation watched closely. The proceedings were not just about punishing one man, but about reaffirming Singapore's commitment to integrity and justice. Prosecutors laid out their case in meticulous detail, presenting overwhelming evidence of Lim's corrupt dealings. The charges against him centered on the fact that he had granted special favors to specific companies bidding for contracts with the Singapore Civil Defence Force, SCDF. In exchange, he had received personal benefits, including sexual services from women linked to these businesses. The courtroom was filled with legal experts, journalists, and members of the public, all eager to witness how the case would unfold. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a man who had used his powerful position not to serve his country, but to serve his own selfish desires. According to their findings, Lim had leveraged his authority to influence procurement decisions in favor of certain vendors, bypassing fair competition and ethical considerations. One of the most shocking revelations came when evidence was presented showing that Lim had arranged meetings with female executives from private companies that had business dealings with the SCDF. These meetings, initially disguised as professional discussions, had often taken place in private hotel rooms or secluded locations. Witnesses, including some of the women involved, testified that Lim had made it clear, directly or indirectly, that business opportunities would be granted in exchange for personal favors. Some of the women stated that they had felt pressured into complying, fearing that rejecting him would jeopardize their company's chances of securing lucrative government contracts. Financial records and digital communications provided further proof of the corruption. Emails and text messages retrieved from Lim's phone and computers revealed coded conversations where he arranged meetings and discussed procurement matters with the involved companies. There were also bank transfers and expense records indicating that he had accepted expensive gifts and entertainment from business executives in return for awarding them contracts. The prosecution emphasized that these acts were not isolated incidents but part of a sustained pattern of abuse spanning several years. The defense, however, attempted to argue that Lim had not explicitly demanded these favors, and that any gifts or services he received were given voluntarily, with no direct link to contract awards. His lawyers claimed that while Lim had indeed engaged in inappropriate relationships, they did not amount to corruption under the law. They also argued that the bidding process for SCDF contracts was complex and involved multiple decision-makers, meaning that Lim alone could not have guaranteed any specific outcomes. However, the prosecution swiftly dismantled these arguments by presenting internal documents showing that Lim had personally recommended certain vendors for contracts. Testimonies from SCDF officers further revealed that he had exerted significant influence over procurement decisions. Some officers admitted that they had suspected irregularities, but had been reluctant to question a superior as powerful as Lim. The culture of deference within the organization had allowed him to act with impunity for years. Public reaction to the case was intense. Singaporeans, accustomed to a government that upheld strict anti-corruption policies, were outraged that someone of Lim's rank had been able to operate in such a manner. Many questioned whether the existing oversight mechanisms were strong enough to prevent such abuses in the future. Editorials in major newspapers criticized the lapse in internal controls and called for stricter regulations to ensure that high-ranking officials were held to the highest ethical standards. The government, determined to reassure the public, swiftly announced measures to prevent similar cases from occurring. The Civil Service Commission pledged to strengthen internal audits and introduce additional training for senior officers on ethics and accountability. Transparency International, an organization monitoring global corruption, noted that while Singapore remained one of the least corrupt countries in the world, the case demonstrated that no system was entirely immune to human greed and misconduct. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the evidence against Lim became undeniable. The prosecution's meticulous presentation of documents, testimonies, and financial records left little room for doubt. The final arguments made it clear that Lim had systematically abused his authority, betraying not only his position but the trust placed in him by the government and the people of Singapore. The verdict loomed, and Singaporeans waited anxiously. What would happen to Peter Lim Sin Peng? Would he face the full extent of the law, or would his years of service and high-ranking status influence the court's decision? Whatever the outcome, one thing was certain. This case had left a deep scar on the reputation of the nation's civil service, serving as a stark reminder that even in a country known for its clean governance, corruption could still find a way to creep in. The final days of Peter Lim Sin Pang's trial were filled with tension. The prosecution had delivered an overwhelming case, proving beyond reasonable doubt that Lim had engaged in corrupt activities, using his position as the commissioner of the Singapore Civil Defense Force, SCDF, for personal gain. His fate now rested in the hands of the judge, and the entire nation waited for the verdict that would determine whether one of Singapore's most senior civil servants would be held accountable for his crimes. On the day of the ruling, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public. The judge took time to summarize the case, reiterating the prosecution's key arguments. Lim had knowingly engaged in unethical conduct, abused his authority to influence contract awards, and accepted improper benefits from vendors. The judge acknowledged that Singapore was a country that prided itself on its strong governance and zero tolerance for corruption, making Lim's betrayal of public trust all the more severe. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on multiple counts of corruption, the reaction was immediate. Some in the courtroom sighed in relief, while others shook their heads at the disgrace of a once respected leader. Lim, standing before the judge, showed little emotion, though those who knew him said that his stiff posture betrayed deep shame and regret. He had built a career on discipline and leadership, only to see it all come crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. The sentencing followed soon after. Given the severity of his offenses, the court imposed a prison term and a heavy fine. The judge made it clear that Lim's actions had not only damaged his own reputation, but had also harmed public confidence in Singapore's institutions. A strong punishment was necessary to reinforce the message that corruption, no matter how high one's rank, would never be tolerated. Lim was led away in handcuffs, his once proud stature reduced to that of a disgraced convict. His fall from grace was complete. The former commissioner of the SCDF, a man who had once been trusted to protect the nation's citizens, now found himself behind bars, condemned by the very laws he had sworn to uphold. In the weeks that followed, discussions about the case dominated public discourse. Many Singaporeans expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, but there was also a lingering unease. How had someone in such a high-ranking position been able to engage in corruption for so long without being caught? Were there other officials who had engaged in similar misconduct, but had simply not been exposed yet? The government moved swiftly to address these concerns. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong issued a statement reaffirming Singapore's commitment to clean governance, emphasizing that no one, not even top officials, was above the law. The Civil Service Commission announced a series of reforms aimed at strengthening internal monitoring mechanisms, including more rigorous checks on procurement processes, whistleblower protections, and mandatory ethics training for senior officers. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, which had played a crucial role in bringing Lim to justice, received additional resources to enhance its ability to detect and investigate corruption within the government. Meanwhile, Lim's personal life was in ruins. Friends and former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man whose name had become synonymous with disgrace. His family faced public humiliation, with reporters constantly seeking comments and details about how they were coping with his downfall. His wife, who had initially stood by him, eventually filed for divorce, unable to reconcile the man she had married with the man who had been exposed in court. While serving his prison sentence, Lim reportedly struggled to adapt to life behind bars. Unlike the structured and disciplined world of the SCDF, where he had been in command, he was now just another inmate, subjected to strict routines and constant surveillance. His former colleagues in law enforcement, many of whom had once respected him, now viewed him with contempt. Some sources claimed that he was targeted by other prisoners, who saw him as a symbol of hypocrisy, someone who had enforced the law but had secretly broken it for personal pleasure. Despite the scandal, Singapore's institutions remained strong. The swift and transparent handling of Lim's case reassured the public that corruption would never be tolerated, no matter how high the rank of the offender. The nation moved forward, its commitment to integrity and good governance reaffirmed, even as the memory of the case served as a reminder of the constant vigilance needed to uphold ethical standards. Years later, when discussions of corruption in Singapore resurfaced, Peter Lim Sin Pang's name was often cited as a warning. His case became a textbook example in law schools and public administration courses, illustrating how even the most trusted officials could fall prey to temptation, and how a nation committed to justice must always remain prepared to root out corruption, wherever it may be found. As for Lim himself, his time in prison eventually ended, but his life would never be the same. Stripped of his rank, reputation, and privileges, he lived in relative obscurity, forever marked by his past. He had once commanded the respect of an entire nation, but in the end, he was remembered not for his achievements, but for his betrayal. Story 10. Adrian Ernest Bailey had a long history of violent offenses. Born in Australia, he had spent much of his life in and out of prison, with multiple convictions for rape and assault. Despite being labeled a dangerous predator, he had been released back into society, where he continued to pose a threat to women. In 2012, his name would become infamous across Australia as the man responsible for one of the most shocking crimes in Melbourne's recent history, the brutal murder of Jill Maher. Jill Maher was a 29-year-old Irish expatriate living in Melbourne. She worked as a journalist for ABC Radio and was well loved by her colleagues and friends. She had moved to Australia with her husband, Tom Maher, in search of a promising future. On the night of September 21, 2012, she went out for drinks with colleagues at a bar in the bustling suburb of Brunswick. It was a regular night out, and she had only planned to stay for a few hours before heading home. At around 1:30 a.m., Jill decided to walk home alone, rejecting offers from her friends to accompany her. She lived only a short distance away, and Brunswick was generally considered a safe area. But as she made her way down Sydney Road, she had no idea that Adrian Bailey was lurking in the shadows, watching her. Bailey had been prowling the streets that night, looking for a victim. A serial offender with a disturbing pattern of attacking women, he had spent years evading the full consequences of his crimes. When he spotted Jill walking alone, he saw an opportunity. Surveillance footage would later show him following her, his movements calculated and predatory. As Jill neared her home, Bailey approached her, pretending to be friendly at first. When she resisted his advances, he became aggressive. Witnesses later reported hearing a brief struggle, but in the silence of the night, no one realized the danger she was in. Bailey overpowered her and forced her into a dark alley, where he assaulted her before strangling her to death. For hours, Jill's husband, Tom, waited at home, growing increasingly worried when she failed to return. He called her phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. By morning, panic had set in, and he reported her missing to the police. The disappearance of a young woman in a normally safe neighborhood sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, colleagues, and volunteers quickly organized search efforts, putting up missing person posters and appealing for information. CCTV footage soon became the key to solving the case. Investigators retrieved recordings from local businesses, and the images revealed Jill walking down Sydney Road, followed closely by a man in a blue hoodie. The footage sent chills through the public. The police quickly identified the man as Adrian Bailey, a known criminal with a violent past. Bailey, however, did not initially confess. When police tracked him down and brought him in for questioning, he tried to mislead investigators, claiming he had no involvement. But the evidence against him was mounting. Phone records placed him at the scene, and when police searched his home, they found Jill's belongings. With no way to escape the truth, Bailey finally admitted to the crime, describing in chilling detail how he had attacked and killed her. Jill's body was found in a shallow grave about 50 kilometers outside Melbourne. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her loved ones and the entire nation. The senseless violence of the crime horrified people across Australia, sparking national outrage and a renewed discussion on the justice system's failure to keep repeat offenders like Bailey off the streets. As the case moved toward trial, the weight of Bailey's past crimes became clear. He had a long criminal history, including multiple sexual assaults, yet he had been released from prison and allowed to reoffend. The revelation of his record led to intense criticism of the parole system, with many arguing that stricter measures were needed to prevent dangerous criminals from being released. For Jill's family, the pain was immeasurable. Her husband, Tom, spoke publicly about his grief, questioning how someone like Bailey had been free to walk the streets. He became an advocate for justice reform, determined to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same tragedy. As the trial approached, Australia braced for the full extent of Bailey's crimes to be laid bare. The nation wanted justice for Jill Maher, and the legal system now had to decide whether it would finally hold Adrian Bailey accountable for his reign of terror. During the investigation, the full extent of Adrian Bailey's criminal past came into focus, painting a chilling picture of a man who had repeatedly evaded justice. Bailey had spent years attacking women, yet despite multiple convictions for violent sexual offenses, he had been granted parole, allowing him to walk the streets freely. The public was outraged as they learned that this was not his first crime, not by a long shot. He had been a known predator, a repeat offender who had used intimidation and violence to control his victims. Had the justice system acted more decisively earlier, Jill Maher might still be alive. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting a compelling case against Bailey. He was charged with murder, rape, and other related offenses, and as the legal process unfolded, new details emerged that made the crime even more disturbing. Evidence from the crime scene and Bailey's own confession painted a picture of a man who had not only stalked Jill, but had also been methodical in his approach. Surveillance footage showed how he had walked past her multiple times before making his move, carefully choosing the moment when she was most vulnerable. Forensic experts testified about the evidence collected. Jill's personal belongings, including her handbag and phone, had been found at Bailey's home, further cementing his guilt. Soil samples from his car matched the area where her body had been buried, proving that he had transported her lifeless form to a remote location in a final attempt to cover his tracks. His DNA was found on her body, eliminating any doubt that he had been the last person to see her alive. The defense had little room to maneuver. Bailey had already admitted to the crime, but his lawyers attempted to argue that the murder had not been premeditated. They claimed that the attack had been spontaneous, that he had not intended to kill her, but rather had acted in a moment of panic after sexually assaulting her. However, the prosecution quickly dismantled this argument, pointing out Bailey's long history of violence and the predatory nature of his actions. Public reaction to the case was intense. Protests and vigils were held in Jill's memory, with thousands of people taking to the streets to demand justice. The outcry was not just about her death, it was about the larger issue of violence against women, the failure of the parole system, and the need for harsher punishments for repeat offenders. The phrase "Reclaim the Night" became a rallying cry, as women in Melbourne and across Australia demanded safer streets and stronger protections against predators like Bailey. Jill's husband, Tom Maher, became a central figure in the public response to the case. His grief was palpable, but rather than retreat into silence, he chose to speak out. In interviews, he talked about the devastating impact of losing his wife, about how their future had been stolen from them in an instant. He questioned how a man with Bailey's history had been allowed to roam free, and his words resonated deeply with the public. His advocacy for justice reform gained widespread support, prompting discussions at the highest levels of government about the need for stricter parole policies. As the trial date approached, journalists followed every development closely. Reports detailed how Bailey had manipulated the legal system for years, securing early release despite being classified as a high-risk offender. Experts debated whether the justice system had failed Jill Maher, and by extension, how many other victims might have been prevented if stronger measures had been in place. The impact of Jill's murder extended beyond the courtroom. Women across Melbourne changed their routines, avoiding walking alone at night. Calls for better street lighting, increased police patrols, and stricter monitoring of convicted sex offenders grew louder. The case became a turning point in Australia's discussion on violence against women, highlighting the urgent need for systemic change. Inside the prison where Bailey was being held awaiting trial, fellow inmates had already begun to turn against him. Even among criminals, those convicted of crimes against women and children often faced the harshest treatment. Reports surfaced that Bailey had been attacked multiple times in custody, a grim preview of the kind of life he would face if convicted and sentenced to a long prison term. As the court date arrived, the nation prepared to hear the full details of what had happened on that fateful night. Prosecutors were ready to lay out the brutal reality of Jill Maher's final moments, while the public, still reeling from the tragedy, demanded nothing less than the maximum sentence for Adrian Bailey. For Jill's family and the people of Australia, justice had to be served. Anything less would be an unforgivable failure. As the trial for Adrian Bailey proceeded, the gravity of the case became even more apparent. Bailey's past and his violent history were central to the prosecution's argument. His actions that night were no anomaly. This was the culmination of years of unchecked violence and predation. In court, the prosecution painted a chilling picture of Bailey's life, outlining the series of assaults and offenses he had committed prior to Jill's murder. Bailey had been previously convicted of multiple sexual assaults, yet he had somehow been granted parole each time. His track record as a repeat offender was undeniable, and it became evident that he had been given opportunities to re-enter society despite a well-established pattern of violence. This raised questions that would not be easily answered. How had the parole system failed to keep such a dangerous individual behind bars? Why had he been allowed to re-offend multiple times without facing more serious consequences? In the courtroom, Jill's family and friends sat through the painful testimony. Jill's mother, Martina, had traveled from Ireland to be there, unable to comprehend how a daughter who had so much promise and love to offer had been taken in such a senseless way. Martina, in an emotional statement to the press, described Jill as someone full of life, passionate about her work, and caring for those around her. To her, the death of her daughter was not just a personal loss. It was a symbol of the failure of a system that had allowed her killer to roam free. Jill's husband, Tom, too, was a constant presence in the courtroom. He showed remarkable strength as he attended each day of the trial, but the pain was evident in his eyes. He spoke publicly about the future he had envisioned with Jill, their plans to travel, to grow old together, and how those dreams had been destroyed in an instant. As a victim of Bailey's actions, Tom, like so many others, was forced to reconcile with a life that had been shattered by one man's violence. His efforts to seek justice for Jill, as well as his advocacy for reforming the parole system, had garnered widespread attention, and his voice became a powerful reminder of the lasting impact such crimes have on loved ones. The case also revealed disturbing details about Bailey's behavior in the days leading up to the murder. Investigators found that he had been stalking women in the area, and that Jill was not his first intended victim. He had been following other women before he decided to attack Jill, but he had ultimately singled her out for reasons that were impossible to fully understand. The randomness and brutality of his actions served as a stark reminder of the danger posed by repeat offenders, who often target vulnerable individuals in public spaces. As the trial continued, the defense team for Bailey attempted to argue that his actions were the result of personal issues or mental health struggles, but this was met with skepticism from both the prosecution and the public. Bailey's past was filled with violent tendencies, and the idea that his behavior could be attributed to anything other than a conscious choice to harm others was widely rejected. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who had repeatedly chosen violence, whose predatory behavior was neither a result of mental illness nor a lapse in judgment, but rather the result of a deep-seated disregard for human life. When it came time for the victim impact statements, the courtroom fell silent. Jill's friends and family had been deeply affected by her loss, and their words brought the full weight of the tragedy to bear on everyone present. One friend described Jill as a bright light who had the power to make anyone feel special. Her warm and welcoming nature had touched the lives of so many, and her absence created an irreplaceable void in the lives of those who had known and loved her. These testimonies, filled with love and sorrow, underscored the senselessness of Jill's murder and the profound impact it had on those who were left behind. In contrast, Adrian Bailey remained largely indifferent during the trial. He showed little emotion as the evidence was presented against him, and his demeanor appeared cold and detached, further cementing the public's view of him as a remorseless predator. The defense was unable to provide any compelling explanation for his actions that night, and the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. Finally, the day arrived when the jury would deliberate and decide Bailey's fate. After hearing all the evidence, including testimony from both sides, they began their deliberations. The public and Jill's family held their breath as the jury considered the case. When the verdict was announced, it was a moment of bittersweet relief for Jill's family and the people of Australia. Adrian Bailey was found guilty on all charges, including murder, rape, and indecent assault. The judge, in delivering the sentence, expressed his deep sorrow over the loss of such a vibrant life and reaffirmed the importance of holding repeat offenders accountable. Bailey was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 35 years. It was a harsh sentence, but it was one that many felt was necessary to send a clear message that crimes like this would not be tolerated. Jill's family, though relieved that justice had been served, would never be able to fully heal from the pain of their loss. Jill's life had been stolen in an act of senseless violence, and no legal punishment could ever bring her back. But the conviction of Adrian Bailey was, for many, a small step toward ensuring that no other family would have to suffer the same fate. In the aftermath of the trial, Australia's justice system came under intense scrutiny, and calls for reform intensified. The tragic case of Jill Maher had ignited a movement for stronger laws and stricter parole policies, aiming to prevent further tragedies from occurring. For Tom Maher, the journey of grief and advocacy had only just begun. He remained a vocal advocate for justice reform, determined to ensure that the system worked to protect the vulnerable and prevent future victims. While the pain of losing Jill would never fade, Tom found strength in his commitment to honor her memory through his efforts to ensure that justice would prevail in future cases. The memory of Jill Marr, a young woman with so much potential, would live on in the hearts of those who loved her. The fight for justice and safety continued, but the pain of that tragic night would never be forgotten. Story 11. Mark Bridger, a 46-year-old man from the small town of Mackinac, Wales, became the prime suspect in the abduction of 5-year-old April Jones. Bridger, a former slaughterhouse worker, had a history of alcohol abuse and was known to have an unsettling personality. Though he had no direct criminal record for offenses against children, he had been previously investigated for incidents of inappropriate behavior. Despite this, he lived alone in a remote cottage, a short distance from April's home, and had been seen in the area on the evening of her disappearance. On October 1, 2012, April Jones, a lively and spirited 5-year-old girl, went missing after playing near her home in the quiet town of Mackinac. She had told her mother, Coral, that she would be playing with friends and would return shortly. However, when night fell and April didn't return, Coral grew concerned. The minutes turned into hours, and panic set in as April's disappearance became increasingly alarming. Coral, along with a few friends and neighbors, immediately began searching the area, hoping to find her daughter. By the time they realized April was truly missing, they had already scoured much of the nearby area, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't long before Coral called the police, who immediately launched a search operation. The entire community rallied together, volunteering to help search, and the police coordinated a widespread effort, employing helicopters, sniffer dogs, and even divers to search nearby water sources. But despite the collective efforts of both authorities and the public, there was no sign of April. As hours turned into days, the situation became more dire. The police investigation was rapidly escalating, but there was still no clear leads or evidence. During this time, the media coverage grew intense, and the small Welsh town, which had once been peaceful and quiet, was now consumed by a sense of fear and uncertainty. The breakthrough in the investigation came on October 2, 2012, when Mark Bridger was arrested. Police had been looking into local individuals who had been in the area on the night April disappeared, and Bridger quickly became a person of interest. After conducting a series of interviews and searches, they discovered that Bridger had been near the location where April was last seen. As authorities continued to gather evidence, it became clear that Bridger had played a central role in her abduction. The details surrounding Bridger's actions that night were disturbing. He admitted to abducting April, claiming that he had taken her for a ride in his vehicle. He later confessed to having killed her, though his explanations were fragmented and contradictory. He led investigators to an area where they found human remains. The evidence suggested that April had been murdered, and the forensic findings confirmed the worst. The remains were indeed those of the young girl. The case had now turned from a missing persons search to a horrific murder investigation. The arrest of Mark Bridger shocked the entire community. Although Bridger had previously been under investigation for minor incidents, no one had expected him to be capable of such a violent crime. His neighbors described him as someone who kept to himself, and there had been little indication that he harbored any violent tendencies. The fact that he had been living in the same community as April, yet had harbored such dark intentions, sent waves of fear and disbelief throughout Mackinac. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Bridger had carefully planned the abduction. He had been driving around the area on the night April went missing, and had come across her while she was playing with friends. He took advantage of the situation, luring her into his car, and from that point on, he was in control of her fate. The disturbing nature of the crime left both the investigators and the public horrified. The police learned that Bridger had tried to conceal his actions, even washing the car and burning items that may have been connected to the crime. Despite his attempts to cover his tracks, however, evidence mounted against him. Forensic analysis revealed traces of April's blood in his car, and when police searched his home, they found further evidence that connected him to the crime. The news of April's death devastated her family and the entire nation. The tragedy brought to light the vulnerabilities that children face, even in seemingly quiet and safe communities. April's parents, Coral and Paul Jones, were left to grapple with the loss of their young daughter, their lives shattered by the horrific crime. They began to speak out about the need for more vigilance in protecting children, and for stronger punishments for those who commit such heinous acts. The case of April Jones captured the attention of the United Kingdom, with thousands of people following the details of the investigation closely. As the trial date approached, the nation prepared to see justice served for April. As Mark Bridger's trial began in 2013, the details of his abduction and murder of April Jones were carefully laid out in the courtroom, each revelation more harrowing than the last. Bridger stood trial for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of the 5-year-old girl, and the courtroom was filled with tension as both the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. The prosecution's case was built on a substantial body of evidence. They painted a grim picture of Bridger's actions on the night of April's disappearance. Bridger had driven around the small town of Mackinac, carefully searching for an opportunity. He saw April playing outside near her home and took advantage of the situation. It was clear from the surveillance footage, the testimonies of witnesses, and Bridger's own statements that April was completely unaware of the danger she was about to face. As Bridger drove up to April, he convinced her to climb into his car by telling her that he had seen her parents. Once she was inside, however, things took a darker turn. The chilling nature of what happened next was revealed in the details of the investigation. Bridger had no intention of returning April safely. He had been planning her abduction, and it quickly became apparent that his motives were disturbingly twisted. He drove her to his home, where he kept her for several hours, before ultimately taking her life. The prosecutor emphasized the brutal nature of the crime, highlighting that Bridger had shown no remorse for his actions and had attempted to destroy all evidence in an effort to cover his tracks. Throughout the trial, Bridger's lack of empathy for his victim became painfully clear. When police asked him why he had taken April's life, his responses were often incoherent and nonsensical. He claimed that he hadn't meant to hurt her, but his actions told a different story. Evidence found at his home revealed that he had been preparing for the crime. He had a history of inappropriate behavior, and experts pointed to a long-standing pattern of predatory tendencies. Though his defense team attempted to argue that he was suffering from a temporary lapse in judgment, the overwhelming evidence painted a picture of a man who had planned and carried out a cold-blooded murder. The prosecution also brought attention to Bridger's behavior after the crime. He had spent hours trying to cover up the evidence, washing his car, and burning clothing that might have been contaminated with April's blood. His attempts to destroy the evidence made it clear that he knew exactly what he had done, and he had no intention of being caught. Yet, despite his best efforts to conceal the truth, the forensic evidence was irrefutable. DNA traces of April were found in his car, and traces of her blood were discovered on his clothing. The defense, in contrast, sought to portray Bridger as someone who had momentarily lost control. They argued that he had not planned the murder and had been overcome by some sort of panic after abducting April. They suggested that he had not meant to harm her, but had acted in a confused, erratic state. However, this defense was largely rejected by both the prosecution and the public. Bridger's long history of erratic and predatory behavior suggested that his actions were more deliberate than he was willing to admit. His complete lack of remorse and his attempts to cover up the crime painted him as a man who had planned the abduction and murder in cold blood. As the evidence mounted, the trial reached its final stages. The jury was tasked with deciding Bridger's fate, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. For April's family, the months of uncertainty and heartache had finally led to this moment. Coral and Paul Jones, April's parents, had shown remarkable strength throughout the trial. They attended each day, sitting through the painful testimony, never losing sight of their goal to ensure that April's murderer would be brought to justice. Their pain was evident, but they also demonstrated incredible resilience, speaking out about the dangers of child abduction and the need for stronger protections for children everywhere. In a final emotional statement, April's parents described their daughter as a happy and loving child, full of life and promise. They shared their grief and the void that had been left in their lives by her untimely death. No sentence could ever bring April back, but they hoped that by standing firm in their commitment to justice, they could help protect other children from facing the same fate. Finally, after several days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Mark Bridger was found guilty of the murder, abduction, and sexual assault of April Jones. The court was silent as the verdict was read aloud. For many, the guilty verdict was a small measure of justice for the devastating loss of a young girl whose life had been stolen in an instant. In his sentencing, the judge condemned Bridger's actions as cold and calculated. He described the crime as one of the most horrific the court had ever seen and emphasized the profound impact it had on April's family and the community. Bridger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be allowed to walk free again. The sentence was met with a sense of relief, but for April's family, the damage had already been done. The man who had stolen their daughter's future would now pay for his crimes, but nothing could ever bring her back. April's memory lived on, and the community of Mackinac, along with the rest of the United Kingdom, mourned the tragic loss of a young life. In the aftermath, discussions about child safety, the risks of abduction, and the need for stronger laws became more prominent. April's case served as a painful reminder of the dangers that children face, even in seemingly safe communities, and the need to take every precaution to protect them. The aftermath of April Jones's abduction and murder reverberated throughout the UK, leaving a lasting impact on the community, the justice system, and society as a whole. As the trial concluded, the sense of relief from the guilty verdict was bittersweet. While Mark Bridger was sentenced to life imprisonment, the pain of the loss and the void left by April's tragic death remained unfilled. The court proceedings had revealed the depth of Bridger's calculated cruelty, and the chilling nature of his crime would forever be etched into the memories of those who followed the case. The response from the public, the media, and organizations dedicated to child protection was overwhelming. The case highlighted significant issues surrounding child safety and the shortcomings in both the local and national systems in preventing such tragic events. People across the UK rallied in support of April's family, with many expressing their sorrow and solidarity. The story of the Jones family's grief resonated with countless others, and their voices became a rallying cry for action. In the wake of the trial, Coral and Paul Jones became advocates for child safety, dedicating themselves to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to experience the same horror they had endured. They publicly campaigned for stronger child protection measures, including stricter regulations for people with criminal backgrounds and a more robust system for monitoring those who had previously committed offenses. Their advocacy work highlighted the importance of better systems for keeping track of dangerous individuals, as well as more comprehensive education for parents and communities about the risks of abduction and how to respond. The Jones family's efforts culminated in the establishment of the April Jones Foundation, which was dedicated to improving the safety of children and preventing child abduction. The foundation worked closely with law enforcement, child welfare organizations, and schools to raise awareness about the dangers children face and to provide resources to help parents and communities protect their young ones. Through this foundation, the Jones family channeled their grief into a powerful force for positive change. Although nothing could bring April back, their work helped ensure that her memory lived on in a way that contributed to making the world a safer place for children. The foundation also pushed for legislative changes aimed at preventing similar crimes. The case prompted discussions about reforming the justice system, particularly in relation to how repeat offenders were monitored and treated. Many felt that the parole system had failed in the case of Mark Bridger, as his previous behavior had been cause for concern, but was not enough to prevent his release. Bridger's previous behavior, including a history of inappropriate actions and known alcohol issues, had raised red flags, yet he was allowed to return to society. His eventual actions were a stark reminder of how dangerous it could be to underestimate the potential for harm in individuals who showed clear signs of predatory behavior. The media also played a critical role in raising awareness about child abduction and its devastating consequences. News outlets reported extensively on the details of the case, emphasizing the need for preventative measures, while also offering support to the family and the community. The outpouring of public grief and support highlighted the deep sense of loss that the nation felt over the tragic death of a young child. Through interviews, news coverage, and discussions on social media, the public was reminded of the fragility of life and the need to remain vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable members of society. For the people of Mackinac, the tragedy brought with it a deep sense of vulnerability. Mackinac, a small, close-knit community, had always been considered a safe haven. The horror of a child being abducted from such a place shocked the town to its core. People who had once walked freely through the streets, without a second thought about their safety, now found themselves grappling with the harsh reality of what could happen when the unthinkable occurred. In response to the tragedy, local organizations and residents rallied together to improve community safety measures, starting initiatives like neighborhood watch programs and community outreach efforts focused on educating children and parents about safety. While these efforts helped the town begin the healing process, They also underscored the profound impact the crime had on everyone who was affected by it. Friends, families, and neighbors who had known April couldn't help but reflect on the innocence of her life, her bright smile, and the future that was stolen from her. For many, her face became a symbol of the need for stronger action on child protection. The case also led to a wider conversation about the role of social media in cases of child abduction. In the days following April's disappearance, social media played a pivotal role in spreading awareness and encouraging people to help with the search. But it also raised concerns about the ethical implications of media coverage and the need for responsible reporting. The impact of sensationalizing a child's disappearance or crime was something that professionals and advocates in the field began to consider more carefully. Striking a balance between raising awareness and respecting the privacy of grieving families became a critical issue. As time passed, and the memory of April continued to inspire those who worked for change, the case served as a painful reminder of the vulnerability of children. The tragedy of April Jones's death was one of the most heart-wrenching moments in the history of child abduction cases in the UK. But her legacy lived on in the efforts to protect future generations from experiencing the same fate. April's story, though one of sorrow, was also one of resilience and action. The public response to her murder sparked changes in the way society viewed child protection and the systems in place to prevent such crimes. Mark Bridger's conviction, while offering a sense of justice, could never undo the devastation he caused. The grief of a mother who lost her daughter, a father whose dreams for his child were cut short, and a community that was shaken to its core would never fully disappear. But through their efforts to honor April's memory, the Jones family gave the world something lasting, a commitment to making the world a safer place for children, and a powerful reminder that the fight for justice doesn't end with a conviction, but continues through advocacy, awareness, and action. Story 12. Mark Bridger, a 46-year-old former slaughterhouse worker from Machynlleth, Wales, had been living a quiet life in a small, remote cottage. He had a troubling history, marked by alcohol abuse and a reputation for inappropriate behavior, though nothing that would have raised alarm bells in the community. His past included brief investigations for incidents that hinted at unsettling tendencies, but there was nothing that could have predicted the horrific crime he would commit in 2012. On October 1, 2012, Bridger's life would intersect with that of 5-year-old April Jones, whose abduction and murder would later shock not only their small town, but the entire United Kingdom. April, a cheerful and curious little girl, had been playing outside her home in Machynlleth, a peaceful Welsh town where the streets were usually safe and the community was tight-knit. As dusk fell that evening, April told her mother, Coral, that she would be playing with friends and would return soon. It was the last time Coral would see her daughter alive. When April failed to come home that night, Coral began to worry. The minutes turned into hours, and a sense of panic began to set in. Coral, along with neighbors and friends, immediately began searching the nearby areas, calling out for April, hoping she would come running back. The night grew colder, and with each passing minute, their concern deepened. By the time Coral contacted the police, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. A search effort was launched, involving local police, volunteers, and even helicopters, but no trace of April was found. The following days were a blur of frustration and anguish. Police combed the area for clues, speaking to witnesses and reviewing any available evidence. But the investigation would take an unexpected turn on October 2nd, when Mark Bridger was arrested. He had been seen in the area on the night of April's disappearance, and his name quickly surfaced as a person of interest. Initially, authorities had no solid evidence linking him to the crime, but there were enough troubling details to raise suspicion. Bridger, though initially cooperative, became a key focus of the investigation after police discovered troubling signs of his involvement. Forensic teams found traces of April's blood in his car, which further cemented his connection to the crime. It became clear that Bridger had not just kidnapped April, but had planned her abduction with chilling precision. The details of what happened that night began to emerge as police pieced together the timeline. Bridger, after his arrest, would later admit to abducting April. His confession, however, was fragmented and full of contradictions. He claimed that he had not intended to harm her, but the evidence against him painted a very different picture. After abducting her, he took her back to his home, where he kept her for several hours before ultimately taking her life. Bridger's actions were cold and calculated, and his attempts to cover up the crime, by burning clothing and washing his car, showed that he was fully aware of the horror he had committed. When the police finally searched Bridger's home, they found additional evidence linking him to the crime. His home was filled with disturbing items, some of which were connected to previous inappropriate behavior. Though he had no criminal record for child offenses, the evidence suggested a long-standing pattern of predatory tendencies. As investigators continued their search, they uncovered even more chilling details about Bridger's actions that night. On October 5th, the search for April took a tragic turn. Bridger led police to an area where they discovered human remains, and forensic tests later confirmed that the remains belonged to April Jones. The discovery sealed the case against Bridger, and it became clear that April had not only been kidnapped but murdered in the most heinous way. The details of April's death were heartbreaking. Her family was left devastated by the loss, and the small town of Mackinac, where such horrors seemed unimaginable, was left reeling. The arrest of Mark Bridger and the subsequent discovery of April's remains turned the focus of the case from a missing person search to a murder investigation, leaving the entire nation grappling with the brutality of the crime. As the investigation continued, the depth of Mark Bridger's chilling actions began to unfold in the courtroom and in the media. The trial, which began in early 2013, was a harrowing and emotional experience for April's family and the small community of Mackinac, which had been forever scarred by the tragedy. Bridger's behavior in the aftermath of April's disappearance was nothing short of unsettling. The day after he abducted April, he went about his business as if nothing had happened. He cleaned his car and disposed of the clothes he had worn during the abduction. But despite his attempts to erase the evidence, forensic investigators were able to piece together the disturbing chain of events. Traces of April's blood were found in his car, and further examination revealed that the blood was consistent with her DNA. One of the most shocking aspects of the investigation was Bridger's behavior during his initial interview with the police. At first, he denied any involvement in April's disappearance, insisting that he had no idea where she was. But as the evidence mounted against him, he became more defensive and evasive. The police quickly saw through his lies and inconsistencies. Bridger eventually admitted to abducting April, but his account of the events was erratic and confusing. He claimed that he had not meant to harm her, but failed to provide a coherent explanation of why he had taken her in the first place. The prosecution's case against Bridger was compelling and disturbing. They presented the evidence that proved he had abducted April with premeditation. It became clear that he had been watching her that evening, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Surveillance footage showed Bridger driving through the town just before April went missing. He had seen her outside her house and had taken the opportunity to kidnap her. It was a cold and calculated act, and the evidence pointed to a man who had a disturbing disregard for the life of a young child. In the days following the abduction, Bridger's actions showed a complete lack of remorse. Not only had he abducted and murdered April, but he had also gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. He destroyed evidence, including clothes and other items that could have been linked to the crime. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had no empathy for his victim, who had deliberately tried to erase the evidence in order to avoid being caught. The details of the murder were deeply disturbing. It was clear that Bridger had not acted out of panic or fear. His actions were deliberate and methodical. After taking April to his home, he kept her for several hours before ultimately killing her. The exact details of how he murdered April remained unclear, but forensic evidence indicated that he had used a blunt object. The autopsy confirmed that she had died from severe head injuries, and her body had been disposed of in an area near Bridger's home. As the case progressed, Bridger's defense team attempted to argue that he was suffering from a mental disorder that had led him to act impulsively. They suggested that his alcohol abuse and history of mental health issues had clouded his judgment and caused him to commit the crime. However, this defense was rejected by the prosecution and the jury. The evidence against Bridger was overwhelming. His calculated actions before, during, and after the crime indicated that he had been fully aware of what he was doing and had planned the abduction with chilling precision. The most emotional moments of the trial came when April's family took the stand. Coral and Paul Jones, April's parents, spoke of their daughter's vibrant personality, her love for life, and the devastation they felt when they realized she had been taken from them. The grief in the courtroom was palpable as the parents described their daughter's disappearance and the impact it had on their lives. For them, the trial was not just about seeking justice for their daughter. It was about holding Mark Bridger accountable for his actions and ensuring that no other child would fall victim to his predatory behavior. The community of Mackinac, which had once been a quiet and safe town, was left in shock by the events surrounding April's abduction and murder. The people of the town had known April, and many of them had even seen her playing in the streets before her disappearance. The crime shattered the sense of security that the residents had once taken for granted. In the wake of April's death, the town came together in solidarity to support the Jones family, while also grappling with the painful reality that a man they had once known had committed such a heinous act. Throughout the trial, the public's reaction to Bridger's actions was one of horror and disbelief. The media coverage of the case was intense, and it seemed that every new revelation about the crime sent shockwaves through the nation. People were stunned by the brutality of the murder, as well as the cold-hearted way in which Bridger had tried to cover up his crime. The case sparked widespread discussions about child safety and the need for stronger measures to protect children from predators. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was tasked with determining Bridger's fate. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and the public and media were united in their call for justice for April. The verdict came on May 30th, 2013. Mark Bridger was found guilty of the murder, abduction, and sexual assault of April Jones. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Bridger would never be free again. While the verdict provided a sense of justice, it did little to ease the pain of April's family. No sentence could ever bring their daughter back or erase the trauma that had been inflicted on them. For Coral and Paul, the loss of their beloved daughter was something that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But in the aftermath of the trial, they found solace in knowing that their daughter's memory would live on through their efforts to prevent other families from experiencing the same heartache. In the years that followed, the case of April Jones remained a painful reminder of the dangers that children face in an increasingly dangerous world. Mark Bridger's cold-blooded actions would never be forgotten, and his conviction sent a clear message to others who might consider harming innocent children. The legacy of April Jones lived on in the work of her family, who continued to advocate for stronger child protection laws and greater awareness of the risks children face every day. The aftermath of the trial and Mark Bridger's conviction had a far-reaching impact that rippled through both the local community and the broader UK. April's murder was a turning point for discussions on child safety and highlighted several serious issues that had previously been overlooked or underestimated. The case forced the government, child protection agencies, and local communities to reassess how they handled potential risks to children and how effective current systems were at identifying and dealing with dangerous individuals. For the Jones family, the emotional toll of the trial was profound. The pain of losing April could never be erased, and despite the conviction, they continued to grapple with the void left by her absence. Coral and Paul Jones, though devastated, channeled their grief into efforts that would honor their daughter's memory and hopefully protect other families from experiencing the same tragedy. They became staunch advocates for children's safety, speaking out about the gaps in child protection services and pushing for stronger legal safeguards. Their advocacy became a beacon of hope for those seeking justice for their own children and for ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. One of the key areas that the Jones family focused on was improving the monitoring of individuals who had previously been investigated for inappropriate behavior, especially those like Mark Bridger, who had a history of concerning actions, but had not been convicted of any serious crime. Bridger's background had included a history of troubling behavior, including previous allegations of misconduct and the fact that he had been known to drink heavily. However, he had never been flagged as a dangerous individual, and this failure to identify potential risks ultimately allowed him to slip through the cracks. The Jones family pushed for a system that would have flagged people like Bridger and ensured that they were closely monitored, particularly when it came to interactions with children. In addition to their work in child protection, the Jones family worked with lawmakers to strengthen laws related to child abduction and sexual offenses. They advocated for changes to the way convicted criminals were monitored after their release, particularly those who had committed serious offenses involving children. While Bridger was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, his actions raised serious questions about how individuals with a history of predatory behavior could be better scrutinized and prevented from reoffending. The family's work in this area was instrumental in the implementation of stricter monitoring systems and laws designed to reduce the risk of repeat offenses. As the years passed, the memory of April Jones continued to shape the national conversation about child protection. Her case served as a stark reminder of how quickly a child's life could be taken, even in seemingly safe communities. The horrific nature of Bridger's crime served as a wake-up call, forcing lawmakers, law enforcement, and child advocacy organizations to reevaluate the ways in which they could protect children from the predators that lurked in their communities. The case also drew attention to the importance of early intervention and prevention when it came to individuals who exhibited troubling behavior. Many experts believed that earlier intervention in cases like Bridger's could have potentially prevented the tragedy that unfolded. In the media, April's story was continually shared, not just as a tragic tale of a young life cut short, but as a catalyst for change. News outlets followed the legal proceedings closely, but also used the case as an opportunity to spotlight issues of child safety and the importance of community involvement. Public awareness campaigns aimed at educating parents and caregivers about the dangers of abduction were launched, and numerous child advocacy organizations raised awareness about the need for stronger protections. Despite the years that passed, the pain of April's death never fully left Mackinac. The small town, which had once been known for its quiet streets and tight-knit community, was forever changed by the events of October 1st, 2012. Locals spoke of how the loss of April had altered the way they viewed the world around them. People were more vigilant, more cautious, and more concerned about the safety of their children. It was a town that, in many ways, had lost its innocence and had to come to terms with the harsh reality that even the safest communities could be affected by horrific crimes. The town's resilience was evident in the way that residents supported one another through the tragedy. Memorials and tributes were held in April's honor, with people from all over the UK coming to pay their respects to the young girl whose life had been stolen so cruelly. Her family's grief was shared by many, and the strength of the community during such a dark time was a testament to the bonds that held them together. Though the trial had ended, and the justice system had acted to ensure Mark Bridger would never walk free again, the legacy of April Jones's case continued to shape the conversations around child safety. Laws were amended, preventative measures were introduced, and greater awareness was raised. But for Coral and Paul Jones, the battle was personal. Their advocacy and their unwavering commitment to keeping children safe became a driving force in their lives. They continued to work tirelessly, not just to honor April's memory, but to ensure that no other parent would have to endure the same unbearable grief. The story of April Jones is one of unimaginable loss, but it is also a story of strength, resilience, and the fight for justice. Mark Bridger's conviction and his eventual sentence were just the beginning. The legacy of April's life and death lives on in the work that her family and the community continue to do. They will never forget her, and they will never stop fighting to ensure that other children are protected from the horrors that claimed her life.